The Weight of Truth and Love. Unmasking the Machine, America's Descent into Bureaucratic Tyranny and the War for Truth and the Soul of America. Author, Othniel Max Daves. Date, October 30th, 2024. Introduction. Once again, I find myself silenced, not by accident, not due to a glitch, but by a deliberate act from a social media platform that's supposed to amplify professional voices, not suppress them. LinkedIn, a service I pay for, has locked me out without warning or reason, in a cycle that's become all too familiar. This pattern isn't just an inconvenience or a minor irritation. It's a calculated move in a larger strategy to stifle voices of reason and warning, to muzzle dissent precisely when truth is most needed. It's no coincidence that this suppression aligns with critical moments, when elections loom, when the stakes are high, and when real voices pose a threat to carefully controlled narratives. LinkedIn, like the rest of big tech, has become a tool in the arsenal of a vast bureaucratic machinery, both internal and foreign, that operates with one objective: control. These platforms, initially meant to connect and empower, have transformed into instruments that serve the status quo, rewarding conformity and punishing dissent. We live in an era where narratives are carefully curated, where free thought is a liability to those in power. Washington has turned apostate, abandoning its role as a protector of freedom, colluding instead with corporate and foreign powers to create an information stranglehold. This isn't the America we once believed in. This is a land where freedom is a selectively applied privilege, only extended to those who echo sanctioned views, where the truth is treated as a threat, and voices like mine are marked for erasure. I wrote this because it needs to be said. We're witnessing a betrayal of monumental proportions, a systematic silencing of reason, dissent, and truth by the very systems that claim to support democracy and open dialogue. The attempts to silence my voice will only amplify it and prove my position while building my credibility even more. Nothing they can do to me will silence me, nor prevent them from being exposed and face their consequences. This document is a scathing, brutally accurate indictment of the systems and bureaucracy responsible for attempting to fight against us. They will lose and will be brought to justice one way or another. We will stand our ground and take theirs away from them by exposing them and not cowering down before them. Othniel Max Daves. We will not be silenced. Once again, I find myself locked out of my LinkedIn account, a service I've paid for, without warning or explanation. Though too is laughable, this isn't just an isolated inconvenience or a technical hiccup, it's a pattern. It happens with clockwork precision during critical periods when voices of reason and accountability are most needed, when the truth itself demands a hearing. Here we are, standing on the precipice of a pivotal election, and LinkedIn, like so many other platforms, has once again pulled the plug on my voice. This is no accident. This is orchestrated. This moment is a snapshot of a larger, far more insidious issue: the systematic weaponization of our infrastructure to silence dissent, to muzzle freedom of thought and speech, and to maintain a chokehold on narratives that do not align with the establishment's agenda. This is no longer the United States we once believed in. Washington has abandoned its mandate. It has morphed into an apparatus that enforces conformity, compliance, and silence. It doesn't defend freedom. It selectively permits a sanitized, state-approved version of it. The evidence is right here. This pattern reflects a clear alignment between government entities, multinational corporations, and foreign interests, all leveraging technology, social media, and communication channels to isolate, discredit, and suppress voices that dare challenge the status quo. It is as though we are trapped in a net where each strand, be it corporate, governmental, or ideological, is strategically woven to snare and contain dissent. Freedom for them has become a malleable term, bent to fit the interests of a powerful few, stripped of its original integrity and intent. This manipulation underscores a deeper truth. Washington, our so-called leadership, has become apostate. It no longer serves the people, but serves itself, seeking only to maintain control, and feasting on the trust and resources of those it swore to represent. They perpetuate the illusion of democracy, but the reality is a masquerade where control and coercion replace choice and freedom. To call this mere corruption falls short. This is betrayal on a grand scale, an abdication of duty, a dereliction of responsibility, and frankly, an affront to the very principles upon which this nation was founded. We are witnessing not a temporary lapse, but a long-term systemic effort to silence, stifle, and sanitize. This is more than an insult. It's an invasion of our rights, a corrosion of our liberties, and a repudiation of accountability. This latest restriction on my account is a stark reminder that platforms and policies meant to connect and empower us are now weaponized against us. They censor, silence, and erase cogent voices, treating truth as though it were an inconvenience. These are no longer neutral tools. They are instruments wielded with precision to further entrench a corrupted, hostile state apparatus. Washington is apostate. It stands guilty of treachery against the very people it was created to serve, bending instead to the will of a conglomerate of foreign and internal powers that have long since abandoned any semblance of integrity. They don't just fail us, they actively work against us, cloaking their agendas in bureaucratic doublespeak while dismantling the foundation of our freedom. But we must continue to speak the truth even when that truth is met with silence, because if we don't, we surrender the last remaining vestiges of our sovereignty, our voice, and our place in history. And that is something I will not do. To remain silent, to accept these manufactured boundaries on our speech, would be to surrender not only our voice, but our very identity as a people. History has shown us time and again that oppression thrives not only through active suppression, but also through the passive resignation of those oppressed. And here, in what is supposed to be the freest nation on earth, we find ourselves hemmed in by powers that don't just dismiss our rights, they deny them outright. They deny the very humanity of dissent, viewing anyone who speaks truth to power as an obstacle to be cleared rather than a citizen to be heard. They want us isolated, voiceless, afraid to question, hesitant to resist. And make no mistake, this is precisely why they clamp down during election cycles or moments of critical societal choice, because these are the inflection points, the moments when truth has the power to reshape the narrative, to crack the veneer of control that those in power cling to so desperately. I see it for what it is, a direct affront to accountability, a preemptive strike against truth, and they count on our frustration, on our fatigue, hoping that we will eventually disengage, stop fighting, and let them reshape the nation as they see fit. They bank on the quiet acquiescence of those who feel powerless, overwhelmed by a system that has grown so vast, so deeply intertwined with corporate and foreign interests, that it seems impossible to dismantle. Yet even as they attempt to tighten their grip, there is an undeniable paradox at play. The tighter they try to control, the more evident the cracks in their foundation become. They reveal themselves through these actions, showing the world the depth of their own insecurity, their own fear of a populace that may wake up to their deceptions and demand accountability. For in silencing the voices of reason, in locking out those who refuse to toe the line, they expose their own moral bankruptcy, their absolute detachment from the people they purport to represent. In this moment, we stand at a crossroads. We can choose to retreat into silence, to accept the sanitized narrative handed down to us from above. Or we can speak louder, more forcefully, in defiance of the barriers they erect. We can recognize that every restriction, every attempt to isolate and suppress is not just an inconvenience but an opportunity to prove that our voices cannot be bought, bullied, or erased. To those in power who believe they can suppress us into submission, I have this to say: you underestimate the resilience of those who stand on truth. You underestimate the power of a populace that has reached its limit, that has witnessed enough of your games, your deceptions, and your hollow promises. For every voice you silence, 10 more will rise. And for every barrier you build, a movement stronger than the last will break it down. Washington may be apostate, entrenched in corruption, and actively betraying the trust of its people, but the soul of this nation, the indomitable spirit of truth and justice, cannot be corrupted or extinguished. This is our legacy, our duty, to reclaim that which has been taken, to speak for those who have been silenced, and to restore accountability to a government that has long since forgotten its own creed. We are here to stay, and we will not be quiet. The truth is that our silence would be their greatest victory. But every attempt to stifle us only ignites our resolve. They may own the platforms, control the algorithms, and manipulate the public discourse, but they do not own the truth. The truth is ours to hold, ours to speak, and ours to defend. They think this fight is against individuals like me, people who stand up and say, enough. But what they fail to understand is that this is a fight against the very spirit of freedom and truth, the bedrock of this nation. They may control institutions, but they cannot contain the ideals those institutions were built to serve. The framers of this country understood that power, left unchecked, becomes tyranny, and that it is the right and duty of the people to hold their leaders accountable. We are not only their constituents, we are the rightful custodians of liberty. And when they betray that trust, they forfeit their legitimacy. So here we stand on the cusp of a time where every voice matters, where every truth counts. And yet, instead of encouraging dialogue, they aim to cut us off at the knees, hoping that in isolation we will weaken, lose hope, and fall silent. They believe that if they can sever our connections, erase our platforms, and diminish our reach, they will preserve their status quo. But they are mistaken. When they try to erase us, they only make us more resilient. Because for every gate they close, 1,000 paths open. For every account they suspend, every platform they restrict, the movement grows stronger, more adaptable, more determined. They cannot erase the truth any more than they can erase the spirit of those committed to it. Each restriction becomes a catalyst, uniting us, reminding us of what's at stake. Let me be clear, they will not stop until every voice of reason is silenced, until every challenge to their authority is neutralized. This is not a series of isolated incidents. It's a deliberate campaign to rewrite the rules, redefine accountability, and reshape the nation in a way that serves only the few while marginalizing the many. We are seeing the erosion of civil liberties, the quiet dismantling of freedom of speech, and the steady encroachment of centralized control, all under the guise of safety, security, or policy compliance. But I refuse to accept that. This is my stand, our stand, against the creeping specter of authoritarianism dressed in the clothes of progress and protection. They are terrified of what a free and informed people can achieve, and so they strike preemptively, hoping to dismantle that freedom before it can coalesce into real change. For all their power, they cannot erase the truth. The truth endures. It rises above every barrier, every algorithm, every act of censorship. And no matter how much they seek to control, manipulate, or suppress, they cannot stop the inevitable rise of a people who see through the charade. We are those people, I am that voice, and so are countless others. We are citizens of a nation built on courage, on conviction, and on the unbreakable promise of freedom. And we will continue to speak, louder and clearer, until the walls they built to separate us crumble under the weight of truth. They may think that their grip is ironclad, that their power is invincible, but history is a testament to the fact that no empire, no institution built on control and deception can withstand the force of truth for long. Every system that seeks to silence, manipulate, or suppress eventually collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy. And while they may operate with impunity now, there is an inevitable reckoning that awaits. It is not just the anger or frustration of the people they should fear, it's the unyielding power of a moral order that cannot be extinguished. The powers that be, insulated by wealth and privilege, believe themselves untouchable, operating in boardrooms and backrooms, far removed from the very lives their decisions affect. They hide behind screens and slogans, painting dissent as extremism and truth as dangerous misinformation. But these facades are thin, and the cracks are showing. They can hide behind corporate jargon and political rhetoric, but they cannot hide from the reality they have created, a divided, disenfranchised society, fraying at the seams under the pressure of lies and suppression. Our voices, our freedom, our right to speak truth to power, these are not privileges granted by platforms or governments. They are fundamental rights forged through sacrifice, protected by the blood of those who came before us. To surrender them without a fight would not only be a betrayal of those who defended these rights, but a betrayal of future generations who deserve to inherit a nation where liberty means more than a slogan, where truth still has a place, and where power is held to account. And so I will continue to speak, to write, to connect with others who see through the veneer, who understand the stakes. Every attempt to silence only serves as fuel for the fire. We are not simply voices in the wilderness. We are the living legacy of a nation that was built on the courage to question, to challenge, and to defy unjust authority. This is our heritage, and it is one they cannot erase. I refuse to be intimidated by their tactics or demoralized by their methods. Let them restrict accounts, censor content, and manipulate narratives. Let them believe they have the upper hand. For every time they act to silence one of us, they amplify the very cause they seek to suppress. They force us to find new ways, new channels, new alliances, and in this process they strengthen our resolve, turning a spark into a flame and a flame into a movement. This isn't just about a social media account or an election cycle. It's about the future we are building or losing. It's about standing up to a system that sees citizens not as voices to be heard, but as subjects to be managed. It's about refusing to surrender to a manufactured reality crafted by those who think they are above accountability. And it's about reclaiming our place, our voice, and our rights, regardless of the barriers they erect. So I say to those who wield this censorship as a weapon, we see you. We know what you are doing, and we will not be cowed. You may silence me temporarily, block my access, or obscure my voice, but you cannot kill the truth. We will continue undeterred as we always have, because that is what it means to be a free people. And someday soon, the walls you've built to contain us will fall, and the voices you tried to silence will resound louder than ever before. This is the fight of our time, and it is one we cannot afford to lose. Because in the end, when the dust settles and the facade crumbles, we will either be a people who stood for truth and freedom, or a people who surrendered them. And I know which side I choose. To understand how their systems work is to pull back the curtain on a carefully orchestrated machinery that operates in the shadows, exploiting the trust of the public to carry out an agenda that serves only a select few. These systems are designed with precision, backed by vast resources and fortified by layers of bureaucratic, corporate, and technological insulation. They function on a single premise: control. The primary objective is not the truth, nor the welfare of the people, but the maintenance of an ecosystem where power is consolidated, dissent is neutralized, and narratives are sanitized to ensure compliance and submission. First, there's the infrastructure of influence, which they've woven into nearly every platform, agency, and institution. This network doesn't just reach into the realms of government, but extends through media, academia, technology, and finance, forming a lattice that can influence opinion, stoke division, and steer the public toward predefined conclusions. Through these nodes of influence, they control the public conversation, frame issues, and dictate what is acceptable to discuss and what is dangerous or misleading. This is achieved by using algorithms that prioritize certain voices while silencing others. These algorithms are not benign, neutral codes. They are programmed to filter, shape, and manipulate public perception. They reward conformity and punish dissent, favoring content that aligns with sanctioned narratives while downgrading, shadow banning, or outright deleting content that challenges it. This isn't accidental. It's engineered to create an echo chamber where only one set of ideas is amplified, giving the illusion of consensus while erasing authentic voices that pose inconvenient truths. Why do they do it? Because a populace that thinks critically, that questions, that resists, is a threat to their power. In their eyes, the free exchange of ideas represents a destabilizing force. They need us divided, isolated, and suspicious of one another because unity among the people threatens the stability of their control. By keeping the population in a state of perpetual conflict, liberal versus conservative, rural versus urban, young versus old, they divert attention away from the true conflict, the struggle between the people and an elite that governs without accountability. Another arm of this system is their strategy of selective outrage, manipulating public sentiment through a revolving door of crises and controversies, designed not to inform but to exhaust. They bombard us with sensationalism, feeding the public a steady diet of outrage, scandal, and panic, keeping the population in a state of constant anxiety. This endless churn of fear and distraction dulls critical thought, creating a reactive rather than reflective citizenry. It becomes a smokescreen where meaningful issues are buried under a deluge of trivial controversies and where people are too distracted or too tired to notice the erosion of their own rights. Then, there is the direct control of the narrative through partnerships between big tech and government agencies. Under the guise of combating misinformation, they have weaponized fact-checking and content moderation to enforce a single monolithic viewpoint. Organizations that should act as guardians of truth have become enforcers of orthodoxy, selectively debunking claims that threaten the agenda while giving free rein to misinformation that serves their interests. This isn't about protecting the public from harm, it's about protecting power from accountability. Why do they go to these lengths? Because they know that a free and informed populace would disrupt the status quo, would demand transparency, and would challenge policies and decisions that favor the few at the expense of the many. They fear a public that could come together in unity and hold them accountable. They fear that if enough people awaken to the reality of their manipulation, the entire system they have so carefully constructed would collapse under the weight of its own deceit. Beyond the machinery of information control, they also leverage economic power to enforce obedience. Through centralized financial institutions and a growing reliance on digital currency, they have created a financial system that can monitor, restrict, and punish dissenters economically. It's a form of financial censorship that enables them to cut off access, restrict transactions, and choke out any source of economic autonomy that resist their influence. It's no accident that discussions around digital ID and centralized digital currencies are increasingly tied to concepts like social credit or behavioral compliance. This financial control is another means of silencing voices, forcing compliance by leveraging people's livelihoods. They also engage in psychological warfare, using techniques straight out of behavioral psychology to sway public opinion and alter perceptions. By controlling the context and frequency of certain ideas, they create a reality in which even absurdities become normalized, repeated so often that they become part of the public consciousness. This is why narratives, even when blatantly false, gain traction. They understand that perception, not truth, is the currency of power, and so they distort reality, weaponizing our own psychology against us, ensuring that lies repeated enough times are accepted as truth. This system thrives because it operates in the gray areas of legality and accountability. It avoids transparency, hiding behind proprietary algorithms, terms of service, and security protocols to evade scrutiny. Government oversight is often complicit, either because it benefits from the same power structure or because it lacks the will to confront the very systems that have grown intertwined with it. Those in power protect one another, ensuring that their interests are preserved, while anyone who threatens to expose the rot is systematically marginalized, discredited, or silenced. But the ultimate goal is deeper still. They aim to engineer a society that self-regulates in obedience, where people censor themselves, report on their neighbors, and abandon any ideas or values that diverge from the norm imposed upon them. It's a form of soft totalitarianism, more insidious than overt oppression, because it operates under the illusion of freedom. They want a populace that is docile, compliant, willing to trade genuine freedom for the illusion of security, and ready to conform to any norm or decree handed down by an unaccountable elite. Yet, despite all their efforts, there remains an undeniable truth. These systems, though vast and powerful, are not invincible. The more they suppress, the more they reveal their fear, their weakness, their desperation. They cannot control every mind, every voice, every heart that beats for truth and justice. And every act of suppression sows the seeds of resistance. As more people awaken to the reality of their deception, our response must be one of unwavering commitment to truth, solidarity, and resilience. We must find ways to build networks that transcend their control, to share knowledge that defies their censorship, and to remember that the rights we cherish are not privileges to be granted, but inheritances to be protected. For as long as we remain vigilant, united, and unyielding, their systems, however sophisticated, however powerful, will ultimately fail. In the end, it is not their algorithms or their policies that define us. It is our shared dedication to truth, justice, and freedom that will endure. Because the truth cannot be erased, the spirit of liberty cannot be contained, and no system of control, no matter how elaborate, can silence the voice of a people determined to live free. These systems serve not only those at the top, but the layers of bureaucracy and mediocrity beneath them, an entire class of functionaries who owe their position, status, and influence to the very machinery designed to maintain power and control. This is a system that elevates the unremarkable, the compliant, the ones who bend without breaking, who never think beyond the rules they're given. These are the cool kids of the bureaucratic world, credentialed but not capable, ambitious but unprincipled, whose authority comes not from merit or accountability, but from their willingness to enforce the status quo and toe the line. In a merit-based system, individuals rise based on integrity, innovation, and the courage to confront problems head-on. But in today's bureaucratic machinery, it's the opposite. Success isn't measured by results or character, but by adherence to a set of arbitrary rules, norms, and loyalties. They don't excel at anything except playing the system, navigating a labyrinth of regulations and policies that serve as both their ladder and their shield. This is how mediocrity not only survives but thrives, by staying in the good graces of a corrupt system that values allegiance over accountability, conformity over courage, and personal ambition over public service. These cool kids form a protective layer around the system, an echo chamber of insulated groupthink that insulates those in real power from any dissent or critique. This layer, built on a web of interdependent loyalty, ensures that accountability is blocked at every level. Each bureaucrat, each functionary, understands that their position depends on playing their part without question. To challenge the system, to point out corruption, would be to risk ostracization from the very network that provides their influence and status. So they don't. They conform, enforcing the rules without examining the reasons behind them, creating a self-sustaining cycle of mediocrity and unaccountability. The effect of this is civil apostasy, a complete and utter abandonment of the principles that should govern public service. Instead of serving the people, this network serves itself, creating a parallel world where the goals of bureaucracy have nothing to do with the well-being of the citizens or the health of society. The system becomes its own justification, a self-perpetuating organism that feeds on resources meant for the people and turns them into fuel for its own expansion and maintenance. Corruption thrives in this environment because the checks and balances that should restrain it are replaced by layers of obfuscation and plausible deniability. Every process is so convoluted, every decision so thoroughly diffused across committees, departments, and agencies that no single person can be held accountable. This is not accidental. It's engineered to be this way. The system is designed to absorb and dilute responsibility, creating 1,000 points of shared accountability that make it impossible to pin blame or demand transparency. When scandal or wrongdoing is exposed, it is invariably buried in procedural reviews, committees, and investigations that produce nothing but reams of bureaucratic language, shielding the actual perpetrators behind a smokescreen of ongoing processes and internal investigations. This lack of accountability doesn't just allow corruption to exist, it actively encourages it. When there are no consequences for failure, incompetence, or even intentional malfeasance, people realize that the system rewards survival and complicity over excellence and honesty. They learn that to succeed, they must play along, perpetuating the very system that would swallow them whole if they dared step out of line. They become adept at maneuvering within this web of mutual back-scratching, knowing that their own power, their own paycheck, and their own protection depend on perpetuating the collective mediocrity that holds everything together. This system becomes a breeding ground for a particular type of individual, one who knows how to navigate the rules but has no sense of principle, one who thrives in the gray areas between regulations but lacks the conviction to act with integrity. These bureaucratic cool kids are products of a system that rewards compliance above all else, that prizes connections over competency. They are adept at using policy and regulation as shields, building careers on the strategic interpretation of rules rather than any meaningful contribution to the public good. Their loyalty is not to the nation, the Constitution, or the people. It is to the machinery that sustains them, a machinery that feeds on the resources of the state while contributing nothing of value to society. Civil apostasy flourishes because the system insulates itself from public scrutiny, feeding on a culture of silence, complicity, and obfuscation. The very individuals who should act as watchdogs become gatekeepers, protecting their own interests over the public's. They rationalize this by convincing themselves they're simply doing their jobs or following procedure, creating a moral blindness that allows them to perpetuate harm while denying any personal responsibility. Their allegiance is not to the ideals of justice, accountability, or public service, but to the rigid and hollow structures they inhabit, a loyalty to process over principle, to hierarchy over humanity. This bureaucracy becomes a fortress, a bulwark against change, reform, or progress, creating blockages that shield those in power from any true accountability. It becomes a self-replicating system that sustains itself by rewarding those who submit and marginalizing those who dissent. Corruption becomes embedded, not as an anomaly, but as a feature, a way of life. And in this environment, the very idea of public service is corrupted, twisted into something unrecognizable, where service means service to the system, not to the people it was ostensibly designed to help. What we are left with is a society where the levers of power are pulled by those whose only qualification is their willingness to perpetuate the system's own survival. These bureaucratic elites, these so-called cool kids of the establishment, do not serve the people. They serve a machine of their own making, a machine that consumes public trust and spits out cynicism, that transforms the ideals of democracy into hollow slogans. They are the gatekeepers of a new kind of authoritarianism, one that doesn't need a dictator because it operates through a faceless, unaccountable bureaucracy, where loyalty to procedure has replaced loyalty to principle, and where the machinery of the state serves no one but itself. This is civil apostasy at its most insidious. It's the betrayal of the very foundations upon which society should rest, a society where government serves the governed, where the public trust is sacred, and where accountability is non-negotiable. Instead, we have a bureaucratic elite, a protected class of mediocrity, blocking any path toward accountability and leaving the people with little more than a puppet show version of democracy. But the danger lies not just in the corruption itself, but in the apathy it breeds among the public. When the people lose faith in their institutions, when they see the government as nothing more than a bloated network of unaccountable bureaucrats and self-serving elites, they become disengaged, cynical, and ultimately complicit in their own disenfranchisement. The bureaucrats count on this apathy, on a weary public too beaten down to demand change, too skeptical to believe that accountability is possible. The challenge, then, is to break through this machinery, to dismantle this fortress of mediocrity, corruption, and complicity that protects the system from true accountability. It means calling out these cool kids for what they are, functionaries of a corrupted order that has abandoned its duty to the people. It means exposing the layers of bureaucracy that shield corruption and protect those who would misuse power. And it means reawakening a sense of public responsibility and civic engagement that demands transparency, rejects mediocrity, and holds every individual, every department, every agency accountable to the ideals upon which this nation was founded. Only then can we hope to restore the principles of justice, integrity, and true public service to a system that has lost its way. Only then can we reclaim a government that serves the people rather than the interests of a faceless bureaucracy and the hollow elites it shelters. And only then can we end this civil apostasy and rebuild a system worthy of the public trust, where power is accountable, corruption is punished, and mediocrity is not tolerated but challenged at every turn. In diagnosing the systemic problems and corruptions entrenched within our institutions, we must acknowledge an undeniable reality. This machine now functions solely to sustain itself, not to serve the public or advance the good of the American people. What we are witnessing is a transformation of our institutions from instruments of public service into mechanisms of self-preservation. They were created with the intention to serve, protect, and elevate the people. Now they perpetuate cycles of inefficiency, corruption, and alienation, growing increasingly disconnected from the very public they were designed to uplift. The primary driver behind this self-sustaining machinery is a cultural shift within the institutions themselves. Where once there was a mission-oriented commitment to the public good, there is now an insular loyalty to the institution above all else. Every action, every policy, every decision is designed not to resolve issues or serve citizens, but to reinforce the power structure, to protect the status quo, and to expand influence. These institutions have been hijacked by a bureaucratic elite that views public service not as a calling but as a means to secure its own position, a fortress built on red tape and regulatory layers that shield it from any outside scrutiny. In practical terms, this self-sustaining function manifests in layers of redundant processes and obstructive policies. Rather than focusing on outcomes or solutions, the system is bogged down by an obsession with process, where the procedure itself becomes the objective. This shift prioritizes the maintenance of power over the pursuit of public welfare, sacrificing the ideals of service on the altar of institutional preservation. It's a deliberate approach, cloaked in bureaucratic language, designed to obfuscate, complicate, and ultimately protect those within from any demands for genuine accountability or reform. The result is a bureaucratic behemoth that moves like a glacier, slow and indifferent to the urgency of real problems. Problems that could be addressed with straightforward solutions instead become mired in committees, panels, and endless chains of approvals that never lead to action. The system, in essence, is built to resist change. It has created an ecosystem where the people it employs become dependent upon its inefficiency, where solving problems too quickly or too effectively would disrupt the steady flow of funds, power, and influence that bureaucracy feeds upon. The corruption in this system is not just financial, it is moral, ethical, and deeply ingrained. This is a culture where success is measured by the accumulation of authority, not by the benefit to the public. It rewards those who serve the bureaucracy rather than those who serve the people, creating a cadre of careerists whose primary skill is navigating the system for personal advancement. In this culture, true public servants, those who seek to bring genuine change or expose inefficiencies, are seen as threats, marginalized, or driven out. Those who play the game and perpetuate its mediocrity are promoted, while those who dare challenge the machine are sidelined or silenced. This system of self-preservation also relies on an intentional dilution of responsibility, where any given problem is everyone's job and no one's fault. Responsibility is spread thin across countless offices, subcommittees, and regulatory bodies, ensuring that when failures occur, blame is diffused so widely that it becomes meaningless. This diffusion of accountability is a calculated maneuver, a structural defense against reform. By making responsibility untraceable, they shield themselves from any reckoning. No single person, office, or department can be held accountable for systemic failure. Rather, failure is simply accepted as the natural state of affairs. This approach allows the system to shield itself even from criticism. When faced with clear evidence of corruption or incompetence, it issues statements filled with vague reassurances and hollow promises of improvement or investigation. But these words mean nothing. They are public relations maneuvers meant to pacify rather than rectify. The structure remains intact, and the core remains untouched, while the public is fed a steady diet of empty assurances. Meanwhile, the machinery continues to grow. Every crisis, every scandal, every failure becomes a pretext to expand the system further. New departments, committees, and agencies are created to address the problems, but in truth, they only add more weight to the apparatus, further insulating it from reform. The system feeds on its own dysfunction, leveraging each failure as a reason to expand, to demand more funding, to hire more people, and to exert more control. In this way, it not only fails to serve the public, but actively undermines the possibility of ever truly serving them. The system becomes a parasite on the very society it claims to support, thriving on the resources and trust of the American people while offering nothing but hollow promises in return. This self-perpetuating corruption is sustained by a deep-seated aversion to risk, change, and innovation. Every attempt at reform is met with resistance, buried in endless analysis, or watered down until it becomes little more than symbolic. The system cannot allow real reform because real reform would threaten the survival of the bureaucratic class that depends on its inefficiencies. Real reform would mean redistributing resources, redefining priorities, and perhaps most terrifyingly, holding people accountable. So instead, we get the illusion of reform, surface-level changes that leave the core of the machine untouched, unchanged, and unaccountable. This is how the system has become a barrier against accountability. It is not merely unresponsive, it is actively hostile to the notion of accountability. It creates blockages not just to protect individuals within it, but to maintain the entire structure against any force that might demand real change. Any attempt to expose corruption or inefficiency is seen as a threat not only to individual careers, but to the institutional status quo. And so it builds walls, buries data, denies transparency, and obfuscates the truth, all in the name of maintaining stability and public confidence, when in reality it seeks only to preserve itself. As I've written before, diagnosing this system requires understanding that it is no longer a means to serve the people, but an end unto itself, a self-sustaining organism whose primary mission is its own preservation. The good of the public, the welfare of the people, the integrity of public service, these have all become secondary, if not entirely irrelevant. Instead, the system has adopted a new ethos: survival at any cost, even if that cost is the erosion of the very foundations of trust and accountability upon which it was built. In diagnosing this, we must recognize that the issue is not merely bad apples or isolated instances of corruption. This is structural, systemic, and intentional. It's a culture that elevates compliance over competence, self-interest over public service, and survival over accountability. It's a system that doesn't just tolerate corruption, it requires it as a means of perpetuating itself. And as long as it remains insulated from accountability, it will continue to grow, devouring resources and eroding the public's faith in government. This diagnosis is not a cry for mere reform, but a call to confront the system's very existence, its purpose, and its allegiance. This system, as it stands, does not exist to serve the people. It exists to perpetuate itself, to sustain the lives and careers of those within it, while turning a blind eye to the public it was designed to protect. The American people have been left with a hollowed-out version of governance, where those in power serve not a nation, but an apparatus, where public trust is exploited rather than earned, and where the very concept of accountability has been replaced with an endless cycle of excuses. To change this, we must start with a ruthless honesty about the nature of the problem. This is not just bureaucracy, it's a betrayal of the social contract. This is not merely inefficient, it's a moral failure on a national scale. The system is not broken, it functions precisely as it was designed, no longer as a servant of the people, but as a shield for the powerful, a mechanism for maintaining the status quo, and a barrier against the very accountability that would reveal its corruption. The American people deserve better, and we will continue to diagnose, to expose, and to challenge this machine until it is replaced with a system that remembers its purpose, to serve the people, not itself. Leaders and systems that consider themselves beyond reproach position themselves as untouchable, immune to critique, and insulated from consequences. They embody an arrogance that doesn't merely avoid accountability, but rejects it outright, operating under the premise that they are above the judgment of those they are supposed to serve. This is not leadership. It is self-idolatry, a posture that says, we are the authority and we answer to no one. Such leaders create systems that reflect this very ethos, reinforcing structures where criticism is unwelcome, questioning is seen as insubordination, and transparency is a liability. These systems build walls, both literal and figurative, between the decision makers and the public, embedding themselves in layers of bureaucracy and hiding behind committees, protocols, and policies that deflect scrutiny and shield power. This setup is meticulously crafted to obscure who is responsible, making it nearly impossible to hold any single person accountable for decisions or outcomes. When leaders and systems operate beyond reproach, they inevitably drift toward corruption. The absence of accountability creates a breeding ground for misuse of power, where decisions are no longer guided by principles or ethics, but by self-interest, personal ambition, and the consolidation of control. In such an environment, leaders view accountability as an impediment to their agenda. They believe that they alone have the wisdom, vision, or expertise to lead, and therefore any questioning of their authority is dismissed as irrelevant, misguided, or even dangerous. This detachment from accountability also erodes any meaningful checks and balances. Leaders who see themselves as beyond reproach cultivate a culture where subordinates are not encouraged to challenge or question, but are instead incentivized to reinforce the hierarchy. They surround themselves with loyalists who echo their beliefs and shield them from inconvenient truths, creating an echo chamber where dissent is stifled and accountability fades into oblivion. This is how organizations lose touch with reality, becoming so self-absorbed that they ignore or dismiss legitimate concerns and critiques, viewing them as nuisances rather than as crucial guardrails for responsible governance. Beyond reproach also means beyond consequences. In systems like this, leaders come to believe they can act without fear of repercussions, emboldened by the knowledge that their position insulates them from the fallout of their decisions. This is why we see leaders enacting policies that harm, deceive, or exploit without hesitation or remorse, because they know they will never have to face the consequences of their actions. They do not bear the cost of their failures, the public does, and as long as they can deflect, distract, or manipulate, they remain unscathed, sitting in seats of power while the people shoulder the burden of their choices. But the danger is deeper than mere corruption or incompetence. When leaders and systems operate without accountability, they slowly dismantle the principles of justice, equality, and integrity that should underpin any institution of public service. They replace these ideals with a new ethos, self-preservation. In this worldview, public welfare, transparency, and honesty are not priorities. They are obstacles to be managed or, if possible, eliminated altogether. Such leaders believe that their vision justifies any means, their authority excuses any abuse, and their position places them above the very people they govern. They rule not as servants of the public, but as self-appointed arbiters of truth, free to redefine reality to suit their agenda. This is why so many of these systems lean heavily on public relations, image management, and carefully crafted narratives. They must convince the public not only of their legitimacy, but of their infallibility, wrapping themselves in the guise of experts or protectors while discrediting or dismissing any voices that call them into question. This is the reason behind the curated, controlled messages that come from these institutions, the endless statements, press releases, and public displays that present a sanitized version of reality. They seek not to inform, but to pacify, to create the illusion of responsibility while concealing the depths of their own detachment and corruption. In the long run, leaders and systems beyond reproach lose the trust of the people even if they temporarily succeed in silencing dissent. Because deep down, people sense when they are being deceived, when their concerns are dismissed, and when their leaders operate with impunity. This erosion of trust is not just an inconvenience, it's a fracture at the very foundation of societal cohesion. When the people no longer believe that those in power can be held accountable, they lose faith in the institution itself. They become cynical, disillusioned, and ultimately disengaged, seeing no point in participating in a system rigged against them. This breakdown in trust creates a dangerous cycle. As people disengage, leaders become even more insulated, freed from the need to answer to an informed and invested public. This further emboldens them, leading to even greater abuses of power and an even deeper contempt for accountability. What we end up with is a system where leaders rule over rather than govern with, a system that is less a democracy and more a distant, disconnected oligarchy, immune to the concerns of those outside its inner circle. Ultimately, leaders and systems beyond reproach reveal the true nature of power, unbound by principles. They exemplify the old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely. When leaders view themselves as untouchable, they begin to believe that they alone are fit to decide what is right, what is necessary, and what is true. This isn't governance. It's tyranny wrapped in the cloak of authority. The antidote to this is a relentless insistence on accountability. True leaders welcome scrutiny, invite critique, and recognize that their power is not a right, but a responsibility. They understand that leadership is not about ruling without question, but about serving with integrity. They know that no one, no matter their position, should be beyond reproach. Because when leaders and systems are held accountable, they remain grounded in the reality that their actions have consequences, and that they, too, are answerable to the principles of justice and the people they serve. In diagnosing the corrosion of our current system, we must confront this culture of immunity head-on. We must insist that no leader, no institution, no policy is exempt from examination. Accountability must be restored, not as a formality, but as a bedrock principle. It is the safeguard against abuse, the check against corruption, and the guarantee that those in power are there to serve, not to rule. Without this return to accountability, leaders and systems beyond reproach will continue to undermine the public's trust, dismantling the very fabric of a government by and for the people. And the longer they operate without consequence, the further they drift from their original purpose, transforming public service into self-service and leaving behind a legacy not of leadership, but of betrayal. We cannot afford to allow this erosion to continue, because a system that answers to no one serves no one. It becomes a machine of power for its own sake, disconnected from the needs, values, and will of the people. The call then is to reclaim accountability, to demand transparency, and to insist that leadership is not a shield from criticism, but a call to responsibility. Leaders who are beyond reproach are leaders who are ultimately unfit to lead, because true leadership embraces accountability as the highest form of service, recognizing that real authority lies not in the power to silence others, but in the courage to listen, answer, and be held to account. These leaders and systems operate not out of strength or confidence, but out of a deep-seated insecurity, an underlying awareness of their own insufficiency, incompetency, and lack of genuine merit. To maintain control, they don't just ignore competent servant leaders, they actively suppress them, viewing anyone with integrity, vision, or skill as a threat to their carefully constructed facade. They understand, consciously or not, that real leadership exposes their own shortcomings, revealing just how far they have strayed from the ideals they claim to uphold. And so they work tirelessly to lock out voices of true character, transparency, and dedication, because such voices reveal their hollow nature and force accountability where none exists. In an environment where power is prioritized over purpose, genuine servant leaders are unwelcome precisely because they embody virtues that the system lacks: humility, wisdom, and a commitment to the greater good. Such leaders do not seek control for its own sake. They are driven by a higher calling to serve, to uplift, and to restore. But in a system entrenched in self-preservation, these virtues are seen as liabilities. Genuine competence and integrity throw the insufficiency of the status quo into sharp relief, and those in power cannot afford such comparisons. They know that a servant leader's competence would expose the failings of the entrenched leaders, making it clear that those in power are not there due to merit, but due to their mastery of the machinery of control. This is why we see systems actively working to prevent voices of competence and moral courage from emerging or gaining influence. They set up barriers, create gatekeeping mechanisms, and erect bureaucratic walls that make it nearly impossible for anyone outside the system's preferred circle to rise. Promotions are given not based on vision, insight, or dedication to the public good, but on loyalty to the system itself. Ambitious but unqualified individuals, those who fit the mold and play by the rules of the power structure, are elevated, while those who would bring genuine reform or challenge the status quo are sidelined, marginalized, and silenced. The system, in effect, becomes a talent filter in reverse, weeding out those with genuine abilities while nurturing a culture of mediocrity. It fills itself with people who excel not in solving problems, but in perpetuating them. Individuals whose main skill is maintaining the appearance of order while contributing little to real progress. This is why we see so many institutions filled with leaders who are adept at navigating bureaucracy, but incapable of true vision or innovation. They are trained to protect their own interests, to recite talking points, and to support policies that serve the system rather than the people. This self-perpetuating cycle creates a culture of fear and complacency, where those who could bring change are isolated and those who merely perpetuate the status quo are rewarded. This rejection of competent leadership isn't just a minor issue, it's a betrayal of the very purpose of these institutions. It deprives the nation of individuals who could offer real solutions to pressing challenges, who could lead with integrity and restore trust in public service. By blocking the rise of true leaders, the system does not just preserve its own power. It actively harms the public, depriving society of voices that could advocate for meaningful change and foster a sense of national unity. These servant leaders, who genuinely seek the good of the nation, are seen as dangerous precisely because they could unify the public around a vision that exposes the failures of the current leadership and shows a clear path forward. The fear that drives the system is not just a fear of competition, it's a fear of exposure. True leadership would lay bare the inadequacies, hypocrisies, and failures of the entrenched power structure. It would reveal that the very people who claim to be the nation's protectors and guides are, in fact, its greatest barriers to progress. This exposure is a profound threat, not only to the individuals in power, but to the very architecture of control they have built. If the public were to see competent, selfless leaders rising to the forefront, it would become glaringly obvious that the system has been holding back progress, stifling talent, and sacrificing the public good on the altar of self-preservation. By preventing these leaders from rising, the system reinforces a narrative that it alone is fit to lead, that there is no alternative, and that any voice calling for change is misguided, naive, or even dangerous. They portray those who would bring accountability and reform as threats to stability, framing any critique as an attack on order itself. This is why whistleblowers, reformers, and visionary leaders are treated not as assets to the nation, but as pariahs to be managed, silenced, or cast out. Their very existence is a living rebuke to the entrenched power, a constant reminder that there are those who still believe in the original mission of these institutions and who are willing to fight for it. But in doing so, the system proves the very warnings and proclamations of those it seeks to silence. Each act of suppression, every time they block a competent leader or silence a voice of reason, they validate the claims of those who call for accountability and reform. They reveal themselves to be exactly as corrupt, insecure, and self-serving as their critics have warned. In their efforts to protect their power, they confirm their weakness, showing that they fear transparency because they know they cannot withstand it. They lock out those who would expose the truth, not because these individuals are wrong, but because they are right. Their competence and virtue threaten to dismantle the entire structure, revealing the profound rot beneath the polished surface of authority. The irony is that in seeking to suppress servant leadership, the system accelerates its own decline. By blocking those who could restore trust, unite the public, and bring meaningful solutions, they ensure that the public's disillusionment only deepens. The people are left with leaders who lack vision, systems that lack purpose, and policies that lack substance. This vacuum of true leadership cannot be sustained indefinitely. As the failures of the system accumulate, as public trust erodes, and as the cries for accountability grow louder, the people will eventually reach a tipping point. The very leaders who have been locked out will find their voices amplified, not by the system, but by a populace that has grown weary of the charade. In the end, leaders and systems that see themselves as beyond reproach sow the seeds of their own undoing. By preventing competent, servant-minded individuals from rising, they ensure that their own failures become impossible to ignore. They may succeed for a time in controlling the narrative, stifling dissent, and projecting an image of strength. But true strength lies in humility, in accountability, and in service to others, qualities that they lack and therefore fear. The voices they seek to silence are not going away. Each suppression only strengthens the resolve of those committed to genuine leadership. Each barrier only deepens the contrast between true virtue and hollow authority. The time will come when the public recognizes this contrast, when the artificial veneer of control cracks, revealing the strength of those who were once marginalized and the weakness of those who once ruled. And on that day, the leaders and systems who sought to protect themselves at the nation's expense will be remembered not for their strength, but for their cowardice, not for their leadership, but for their betrayal. The legacy of true servant leaders will endure because it is rooted in principles that cannot be silenced, in a commitment to the common good that outlasts any system of control. Their voices will rise, not in spite of the barriers, but because of them, proving that the true leaders are those who serve, who sacrifice, and who stand for the people, even when the system stands against them. Their own metrics, methods, and systems of analysis designed to measure performance, outcomes, and the effectiveness of their leadership stand as an indictment against them. These are tools that should reveal the health, strength, and integrity of an organization or institution, but instead, they expose the very corruption, incompetence, and failures they seek to conceal. The irony is profound. The same metrics they use to evaluate and justify their authority tell a story of inefficiency, erosion of trust, and systemic decay. In trying to control and manipulate the narrative, they have created systems of measurement that now testify against them. For example, metrics of public trust, engagement, and satisfaction, indicators that should reflect a system's alignment with the needs and expectations of the people, consistently reveal a profound disconnect. When trust levels plummet, when public engagement declines, and when satisfaction falls, these numbers don't lie. They illuminate the gap between the system's self-perception and the public's lived reality. Despite attempts to spin these results, to reframe them as isolated or contextual, The aggregate data builds an undeniable case that the system is failing to meet its fundamental obligations. The more they try to manipulate the narrative, the more transparent their inadequacies become. Their methods of internal evaluation, designed to assess effectiveness and accountability, also betray them. In theory, these evaluations should be tools for introspection and improvement, mechanisms that reveal weaknesses and pave the way for reform. But instead, these systems are structured to protect the leadership, not hold it to account. Performance reviews, audits, and assessments are watered down, conducted by insiders with vested interests in preserving the status quo. They are not designed to seek truth, but to validate pre-existing assumptions, offering a veneer of accountability without addressing the real issues. Yet, even these manipulated metrics cannot entirely hide the stagnation and decay. The signs are evident in missed targets, budget overruns, and unfulfilled promises. Their own evaluative processes inadvertently reveal the emptiness of their achievements, showing the world a system that is adept at self-preservation but incapable of self-improvement. Then there are the quantitative measures of outcomes, such as project completions, success rates, and efficiency metrics. These are often dressed up with carefully chosen statistics that mask the truth, emphasizing small victories or marginal improvements while ignoring systemic failures. But when viewed in aggregate, these metrics tell a different story. They reveal a pattern of projects delayed, budgets misallocated, and objectives unmet. The constant need to massage and manipulate these numbers to present an image of success only underscores the reality of their failure. If the system truly delivered value, if its leadership truly served the public, there would be no need for such manipulation. The fact that they feel compelled to distort or misrepresent outcomes is in itself an admission of inadequacy. Their methods of evaluating leadership are equally revealing. Leadership assessments should ideally highlight vision, integrity, and the ability to adapt and respond to new challenges. But instead, these assessments prioritize loyalty, conformity, and adherence to the established hierarchy. Leaders are evaluated not on their effectiveness or their commitment to the public good, but on their ability to reinforce the system's values, maintain order, and support those above them. True leadership metrics like trustworthiness, the ability to inspire, and genuine accountability are downplayed or entirely absent. By prioritizing loyalty over competence, these evaluations testify to the system's own insecurities, showing that it fears true leadership because real leaders would expose its failings. Furthermore, when external metrics such as public opinion surveys, independent audits, or international comparisons reflect poorly on these leaders and their systems, they often go into defensive mode, dismissing or discrediting these indicators. Yet, this reaction itself is revealing. Rather than addressing the causes of poor performance, they question the validity of the data, attack the credibility of outside evaluators, or argue that such measures don't capture the unique challenges they face. In doing so, they not only avoid accountability, but openly demonstrate their unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The fact that they feel threatened by objective assessments only reinforces the notion that they know, deep down, that their authority is built on shaky ground. Every attempt to deflect, every effort to reframe or manipulate the metrics points back to the same underlying reality: the system is failing. The metrics they designed to assess success, accountability, and public benefit ultimately become tools that document their own inadequacies, often in ways that can't be entirely obscured or spun. Numbers on paper can be manipulated, but the lived experience of the public, their growing distrust, disengagement, and dissatisfaction cannot be so easily dismissed. The contrast between the metrics they promote and the reality the public endures is stark, and it is that gap that continues to widen exposing the fault lines beneath the surface of their authority. Ultimately, their metrics testify against them because they reveal a system obsessed with appearance over substance, with control over competence, and with survival over service. These measurements, meant to affirm their success, instead document their failures, showing a bureaucracy that is excellent at perpetuating itself but woefully inadequate at fulfilling its purpose. In trying to manage and manipulate outcomes, they have unwittingly created a body of evidence that indicts them. Proof that their priorities lie not in public service, but in maintaining an illusion of effectiveness and control. The tragedy is that, rather than seeing these metrics as opportunities for correction, they use them as shields against accountability. Instead of acknowledging poor performance, they bury it in layers of bureaucracy, blame external factors, or simply shift the goalposts, hoping the public will lose track. But this evasion only digs them deeper into their own failure, deepening the chasm between themselves and the people they claim to serve. Each manipulated metric, each deflected critique, and each superficial reform amplifies the dissonance, providing further evidence of a system that is out of touch, out of time, and out of excuses. In the end, the data they try to twist or obscure will only accumulate, and eventually it will reach a point where it can no longer be hidden. The metrics will become a mountain, a monumental testament to their own incompetence, and a vindication for those they sought to silence. For while they may succeed for a time in suppressing the truth, they cannot erase the record that their own metrics, means, and methods of analysis have created, a record that, when fully realized, will stand as undeniable proof of their own insufficiency, corruption, and betrayal of the public trust. Their own metrics, designed to serve as indicators of success and progress, lay bare the hollowness of their leadership and the decay at the core of their competencies. They may try to camouflage these metrics with superficial spins, but the numbers reveal a stark and undeniable truth. They are not only failing to lead, but actively profiting from this failure, exploiting their positions while driving the system deeper into dysfunction. They know this, and they are deeply invested in maintaining the illusion of competence, leveraging misaligned incentives, manipulation, and machinations to avoid the consequences that genuine accountability would bring crashing down upon them. Their incentives are not aligned with the public good, nor with the principles of transparency, integrity, or service that should guide any leader. Instead, they are skewed toward personal gain, self-preservation, and the perpetuation of control. These metrics are not used to measure real success, but to justify an endless cycle of inefficiency that benefits only those in power. Every metric that highlights failure, every audit that exposes waste becomes a twisted justification for additional funding, greater autonomy, and even less oversight. Rather than driving reform, these signs of failure fuel an upward spiral of influence and resources, funneled directly to those who orchestrate the very failures the metrics reveal. They profit from this misalignment, turning the system's failures into opportunities for personal and institutional gain. For example, when projects are delayed, costs balloon, or outcomes are poor, they argue that the issues are too complex for outside intervention, demanding more resources and control to resolve the problems they themselves perpetuate. It's a cunning sleight of hand, where the appearance of failure is carefully managed to leverage sympathy or justify further investment in their control. The more broken the system appears, the more power they claim they need to fix it, while all the while ensuring that no real solutions are implemented. In this sense, their incompetence is not a liability but a strategy, a carefully managed facade that justifies their continued dominance and provides a shield against reform. Their manipulation of metrics serves another purpose. It protects their egos, allowing them to avoid confronting their own inadequacies. By controlling the narrative, they ensure that their own failures in leadership are never laid bare, never openly acknowledged, and never allowed to reflect back on them. Their fragile egos cannot withstand the truth of their own incompetence, so they create layers of obfuscation to insulate themselves from it. They bury failure in bureaucratic jargon, blame external factors, and distort data, all to maintain the illusion that they are effective stewards of their institutions. It is a delusional attempt to escape the consequences of their actions, an exercise in self-deception that sustains their own sense of self-worth at the expense of the public they are meant to serve. This manipulation also extends to how they evaluate their own competencies. Real leaders would welcome feedback, embrace metrics as a guide for improvement, and use data to hold themselves to a higher standard. But in this system, metrics are never tools for growth. They are weapons of control, deployed to justify the status quo and protect the powerful. They intentionally design metrics that are vague, malleable, or irrelevant to the actual outcomes that matter, creating a smokescreen where success and failure become subjective, unquantifiable, and therefore unaccountable. They craft metrics that focus on inputs rather than results, on effort rather than effectiveness, because this allows them to claim progress without delivering it, to praise their own hard work while ignoring their utter lack of meaningful results. The misalignment between incentives and outcomes, between appearance and reality, is an indictment of their leadership at the most fundamental level. They have built a system where success is defined not by achievement but by survival, where metrics are not a path to excellence but a means of sustaining mediocrity, and where failure is not penalized but rewarded with further entrenchment of power. This is not mere incompetence, it is willful corruption, a deliberate choice to prioritize self-interest over public interest, to profit from the very dysfunction they were entrusted to address. In brutal terms, their metrics are a mirror, reflecting back the rot they try so desperately to hide. The metrics reveal a pattern of stagnation. The data screams of inefficiency, and the outcomes highlight the corruption that has infected every layer of the system. The fact that they continue to resist reform, refuse accountability, and prevent any meaningful evaluation of their performance speaks volumes about the nature of their leadership. They are not leaders but caretakers of a corrupt machine, propping up a system designed to insulate them from the repercussions of their own failings. Their refusal to confront the truth in their own metrics is a clear signal that they know the depth of their incompetence and corruption. It reveals a calculated arrogance, a belief that they can control the narrative indefinitely, manipulate the public's perception, and evade responsibility without consequence. But this is more than arrogance. It is a profound moral failure, an abdication of the basic principles of service and accountability. They are so deeply invested in preserving their power that they are willing to sacrifice the public's trust, the integrity of their institutions, and the welfare of the nation itself. The metrics testify against them because they expose the lie at the heart of their authority, that they are fit to lead. In truth, they are not leaders but impostors, propped up by a system that rewards manipulation and punishes integrity. They have constructed a world where failure is profit, incompetence is strategy, and corruption is business as usual. Their only real competency lies in maintaining this charade, in leveraging misaligned incentives, and in using every tool of manipulation at their disposal to shield themselves from the truth. But no amount of manipulation can erase the underlying reality. Every manipulated metric, every twisted incentive, and every evasion of accountability builds a paper-thin wall around their authority. They may think they are untouchable, that they have built an impenetrable fortress of control, but their own data is a ticking time bomb. The weight of their lies, the accumulation of their failures, and the growing disillusionment of the public will eventually tear down the facade. They cannot avoid the consequences forever, and when that reckoning comes, it will reveal them for what they are. False leaders, devoid of vision, bereft of integrity, and ultimately unfit to hold the positions they so desperately cling to. In the end, their own metrics, methods, and manipulations will be their undoing. They will find that the very tools they use to mask their incompetence will become the evidence of their guilt, the proof of their betrayal. The public, once fully aware of the scale of this deception, will demand accountability, and no amount of spin or obfuscation will protect them. They will be forced to confront the truth they have so long evaded, that real leadership cannot be faked, real accountability cannot be dodged, and real consequences cannot be escaped. The legacy they leave will not be one of strength but of cowardice, a testament not to their ability to lead but to their relentless effort to avoid the truth, and ultimately their failure to escape it. At the heart of this corruption lies a spiritual rot that has spread through the institutions and leaders who have chosen to elevate themselves above truth. In their arrogance, they have not only defied the public they claim to serve, but they have set themselves against the very foundations of divine and natural law, rejecting the principles that sustain justice, humility, and accountability. This is more than just political or institutional decay. It is the final state of a rebellion against heaven itself, where power is wielded not as a sacred trust, but as an instrument of self-worship and defiance. This rebellion began subtly, in small compromises and half-truths, but it has grown into a full-scale war against truth itself, as these leaders reject any authority beyond their own. Their own. Metrics and outcomes reveal a spiritual reality, the consequences of denying the inherent laws of truth, justice, and integrity. They have placed themselves at odds with these higher principles, believing that by ignoring them they can escape their reach. But divine law, like natural law, operates beyond human control. It cannot be evaded or manipulated, and its consequences are as certain as they are unyielding. In their denial, they have created a system that mirrors their own inner corruption, a system built on lies, sustained by deception, and maintained by coercion. They have erected institutions that serve only to reinforce their rebellion against truth. Each policy and metric a testament to their contempt for any authority that challenges their sovereignty. This is why they resist accountability so fervently, because accountability requires submission to truth and acknowledgement that they are bound by principles greater than their own agendas. But instead of accepting this, they have chosen to wage war on these principles, to bend reality to their will, and to enforce a version of truth that serves their desires rather than reflects reality. The consequences of such rebellion are inevitable. This is not merely the violation of human laws or constitutional principles. It is an affront to the natural and divine order, a deliberate act of defiance against the eternal foundations that govern all things. In setting themselves against truth, they have placed themselves on a path of self-destruction, for no system or leader can survive long when built on a foundation of lies. Divine and natural law ensure that actions have consequences, that lies lead to ruin, and that justice ultimately prevails. Their rebellion is, at its core, a denial of this reality, a belief that they can somehow escape the immutable principles that govern both human and divine order. This final state of rebellion reveals a profound spiritual blindness. They are so enmeshed in their own deception that they no longer recognize truth, mistaking power for purpose and control for legitimacy. They have lost sight of the higher calling of leadership, trading humility for hubris, service for self-interest, and truth for manipulation. In doing so, they have set themselves against the divine order, becoming willing instruments of a spirit that rejects truth and glorifies self, a spirit that wages war against heaven's principles on earth. They have chosen to govern not as stewards accountable to a higher authority, but as false sovereigns, rulers of their own empires of delusion. But this war against truth is ultimately futile, for divine and natural law are unbreakable. In their defiance, they sow the seeds of their own judgment. Every deception, every manipulation, every act of suppression only hastens the inevitable collapse. Truth, like a spring held under pressure, can only be restrained for so long before it breaks forth with undeniable force. They may suppress it for a time, distort it with metrics and lies, but in the end, truth will not be denied. When it emerges, it will expose their corruption, strip away their illusions, and reveal the hollowness of their rebellion. The final state of such a system is one where the natural consequences of their choices can no longer be avoided or obscured. Just as darkness flees before light, so too will their lies crumble in the face of undeniable truth. The weight of their own rebellion will become unbearable, collapsing under the gravity of the very principles they have defied. They will find themselves held accountable not just by human laws, but by the eternal laws that govern all creation, laws that they have attempted to ignore, but that have in fact been operating all along. In this moment, the outcomes of their rebellion will become clear, and the full extent of their corruption will be laid bare. They will be seen for what they are: leaders who betrayed their people, institutions that forsook their purpose, and a system that, in its defiance of truth, condemned itself to inevitable ruin. The consequences will be undeniable and unstoppable, as divine and natural law render judgment, exposing every deception, punishing every act of hubris, and bringing low every false claim to power. This is the outcome of waging war against heaven on earth, a self-inflicted judgment that flows from the very laws they denied. For divine law operates as both a guiding principle and a measuring rod, and when leaders choose to ignore it, they find themselves subject to its corrective power. This is not merely poetic justice, it is the very structure of reality, a reminder that all things are interconnected, that truth and justice cannot be severed from leadership without dire consequences. They may have believed they could rewrite reality to suit their ends, but the collapse will reveal that they have only succeeded in building their own destruction. In the final reckoning, they will see that no amount of manipulation, no fortress of control, can shield them from the consequences of defying truth. The system they created will turn against them, exposing every falsehood and every act of rebellion as the natural order reasserts itself. The divine principles they dismissed as irrelevant or outdated will reveal themselves as the very foundation of justice and truth, the immutable forces that demand and enforce accountability. Their fragile egos, their desire to evade consequences, and their self-serving agendas will prove powerless against the reality they sought to deny. The reckoning will not be gentle, for when truth finally asserts itself, it does so with an unyielding force that reveals, purges, and corrects. This is the nature of divine law. It cannot be circumvented or negotiated with, and it renders judgment with a clarity and finality that human systems cannot match. The leaders and systems that wage war against truth will find themselves stripped of every false claim, every shield of manipulation, and every illusion of power. They will face the undeniable reality that they are accountable to forces far greater than themselves, and that their rebellion against truth was, in fact, a rebellion against the very order that sustains life, justice, and peace. In this final state, the consequences will be as clear as they are devastating. The public will see through the lies, the institutions will crumble under their own weight, and the leaders who once ruled with arrogance will find themselves powerless, left to reckon with the truth they so desperately tried to escape. This is the inevitable outcome of rejecting divine and natural law, a collapse that exposes the corruption, purges the deception, and restores truth to its rightful place. For those who align themselves with truth, who serve with humility and integrity, this reckoning will be a moment of vindication. But for those who chose the path of rebellion, who profited from lies and corruption, it will be a moment of profound judgment, a final, undeniable rendering of consequences for a war against truth that could never be won. In the end, divine and natural law will prevail, restoring balance and justice as the false leaders and corrupt systems fall, leaving a legacy not of power, but of judgment, a warning to all who would follow in their path that truth, though often suppressed, will always have the final word. The demonization of those who call for unity, truth, and accountability is a revealing act. It exposes the darkness, corruption, and lawlessness at the heart of those who seek to silence such voices. When leaders or systems lash out against individuals advocating for integrity, they are, in effect, unmasking the forces that truly control them. In their vehement attempts to undermine, marginalize, and demonize those who speak truth, they betray the depth of their own depravity, showing that they are not driven by a commitment to justice or the public good, but by a compulsion to preserve power at any cost. To demonize truth is to reveal one's own inner demons. It is an act that shines a light on the hidden darkness, exposing the spiritual rot that has taken root within these leaders and systems. Instead of responding with humility or self-reflection when confronted with calls for accountability, they respond with venom, framing those who speak out as dangerous, radical, or divisive. But this response reveals more about them than it does about those they seek to silence. It exposes a deep-seated fear, a fear of being held accountable, a fear of losing control, and a fear of having their true nature laid bare for all to see. This reaction shows that they are operating under a spirit of rebellion, one that is fundamentally opposed to truth and alignment with divine and natural law. In their hostility toward those who call for transparency, they reveal their allegiance not to the values they profess, but to a darkness that shuns light. They attack the messengers of truth, precisely because truth threatens to disrupt the illusions they have so carefully constructed. In rejecting calls for unity and integrity, they show that their agenda is not one of reconciliation or justice, but one of division and control. Their unwillingness to listen, to self-examine, or to accept accountability reveals that they are driven by forces opposed to the very principles they claim to uphold. In labeling voices of truth as enemies, they are, in essence, acknowledging the reality that these voices are a threat, not because they bring harm, but because they bring light. This light exposes the lawlessness that lies at the core of their operations, a lawlessness that seeks to subvert justice, evade accountability, and operate outside the bounds of any moral or ethical standard. This is not merely a human failing, it is a spiritual rebellion, an outright rejection of the higher laws that govern truth, justice, and integrity. By positioning themselves as enemies of accountability, they align themselves with forces that are fundamentally opposed to order and harmony, embracing chaos and corruption as the means to retain control. When they demonize those who speak for unity, they reveal their own alignment with division. True unity, built on principles of mutual respect, truth, and accountability, threatens their grip on power. In their rejection of it, they reveal that their leadership is built not on principles, but on manipulation, coercion, and control. They cannot tolerate true unity because true unity would expose the fractures, lies, and corruption they rely on to maintain their authority. And so, they cast those who seek unity as agitators, as disruptors, projecting their own divisive nature onto those who seek healing and reconciliation. This demonization also reveals the depths of their spiritual blindness. Rather than seeing calls for truth and accountability as opportunities for growth, repentance, and alignment with higher principles, they perceive them as attacks. This is because their perception is clouded by the darkness they are beholden to, a darkness that despises truth and recoils from it. This is why they go to such lengths to silence, marginalize, or discredit those who call for transparency, because these calls force them to confront the inner rot that they have long sought to hide. In demonizing truth-tellers, they confess, perhaps unwittingly, their own captivity to forces that oppose goodness, justice, and light. This hostility toward truth does not simply reveal a moral failing. It reveals an allegiance to a spirit of lawlessness and rebellion that operates in opposition to all that is just and right. In demonizing those who bring truth, they are not just resisting accountability, they are aligning themselves with a corruption that goes beyond human flaws. They have given themselves over to a spirit of rebellion, one that defies both human and divine law, rejecting all forms of accountability as though they are above any consequence or correction. This is more than arrogance. It is an outright embrace of depravity, a choice to protect corruption and perpetuate lawlessness rather than confront and cleanse it. This depravity also manifests in the inversion of values. What is right becomes wrong, and what is wrong becomes right. Those who stand for truth are cast as enemies, while those who lie, manipulate, and corrupt are protected, exalted, and upheld as examples. This inversion is not merely rhetorical, it is a spiritual disorder, a distortion of moral reality that reflects a profound disconnection from truth itself. By demonizing those who seek the light, they reveal their allegiance to darkness, showing that they are not governed by any commitment to justice or service, but by a commitment to maintaining their rebellion at any cost. The longer this continues, the more glaringly evident it becomes that these leaders and systems are operating in open rebellion against both natural law and divine order. In attacking those who call for accountability, they are, in essence, waging a war against the truth, a war that places them in direct opposition to the very principles that sustain justice, freedom, and peace. Their rebellion is a mirror of the ancient struggle against heaven itself, where forces that once were good have chosen defiance over obedience, setting themselves up as their own gods, accountable to no one but themselves. The consequences of this spiritual corruption are unavoidable. They may succeed for a time in silencing voices, distorting reality, and defending their illusion of power, but in doing so, they only hasten their own downfall, for the divine and natural order cannot be perpetually ignored. In demonizing the truth, they have set themselves on a collision course with it, a path that will ultimately reveal the futility of their rebellion. The inherent darkness they have embraced will turn against them, consuming the very systems they have built, as their corruption becomes too vast, too obvious to hide any longer. Their actions demonstrate a profound spiritual sickness, a depravity that blinds them to the reality of accountability and consequences. They are so deeply entrenched in their rebellion that they cannot conceive of any higher authority, any truth that they must answer to. But this delusion cannot last. The same forces they seek to silence, truth, justice, unity, are the very forces that will dismantle their systems from within, exposing every lie, revealing every act of corruption, and bringing every hidden deed into the light. The final revelation of their corruption, lawlessness, and rebellion will be undeniable. Their demonization of those who seek truth and unity will stand as evidence of their own depravity, a testament to the depth of their spiritual blindness. They will find that the very voices they sought to suppress will be the voices that testify against them, revealing the spiritual and moral decay that they tried so desperately to conceal. This is the ultimate outcome of waging war against truth, an inevitable reckoning where the very forces they demonize rise up to judge them. The darkness they embraced will no longer protect them, it will turn on them, exposing the depths of their rebellion and the emptiness of their power. They will be left with nothing but the consequences of their choices, facing the undeniable truth that, in setting themselves against the principles of heaven and earth, they have orchestrated their own downfall. And in this moment, the divine and natural law will be vindicated as truth, justice, and unity are restored, leaving their legacy as a stark warning to all who would dare follow in their path. In their duplicity, they proclaim themselves as unifiers while openly dismissing and disparaging half of the nation as garbage, deplorables, or unworthy. This hypocrisy is not merely rhetorical, it is a reflection of profound spiritual and moral decay. By claiming to unite while vilifying and dividing, they reveal the rot at the very core of their thinking. A rot so deep that it has corrupted their ability to see truth, to recognize their own contradictions, and to discern the damage they inflict upon the people they claim to lead. This duplicity unveils a complete breakdown of cognitive integrity. They speak the language of unity, yet every word is drenched in contempt, every promise tainted by an underlying disdain for those who do not align with their worldview. They call for harmony while fostering hostility, using words like progress and tolerance to mask a spirit of control and exclusion. This cognitive dissonance is not an accident. It is a chosen blindness, a willingness to sacrifice truth for power, to ignore their own hypocrisy in order to maintain their illusion of moral and intellectual superiority. Their minds have become so clouded by arrogance that they cannot even recognize the depth of their own contradictions. This spiritual darkness, the profound disconnect between their words and actions, has permeated their entire worldview, twisting even their most basic understanding of leadership and service. Instead of seeing the nation as a unified body, as a collective of diverse individuals with inherent worth, they see it as a tool to be manipulated, a population to be divided and controlled. They have lost the capacity to see the humanity in those they despise, viewing them instead as obstacles, problems, or threats. This is not leadership. It is the manifestation of a soul that has chosen darkness over light, separation over unity, and control over compassion. Their duplicity reveals a cognitive rot that extends beyond politics and ideology, permeating their entire sense of self. In calling themselves unifiers while dismissing vast portions of the populace as unworthy, they demonstrate an utter lack of self-awareness, a blindness to their own hypocrisy that speaks to a deeper spiritual corruption. Their minds have become enslaved to their egos, their cognitive abilities so compromised by pride that they cannot see the absurdity of their own statements. In their blindness, they fail to understand that unity cannot coexist with contempt, that reconciliation cannot be achieved through division, and that true leadership cannot be built on a foundation of disdain. This corruption of thought, this moral blindness, is the outcome of a soul that has rejected humility and embraced hubris. They are so convinced of their own virtue, their own rightness, that they cannot see the darkness within themselves. They have become blind guides, leading not with wisdom but with arrogance, convinced that they alone hold the keys to progress and enlightenment, while regarding those who disagree as expendable, worthless, or morally inferior. This is not the perspective of a unifier, it is the mindset of a tyrant, one who sees people as pawns and who values power over principle, control over compassion. The darkness that clouds their minds is a reflection of the darkness in their souls. In their hearts, they have chosen to abandon the fundamental principles of unity, humility, and respect, embracing instead a worldview that glorifies division, celebrates conformity, and denigrates difference. They claim to lead a nation, yet they divide it at every turn, sowing discord to maintain control, pitting people against each other to strengthen their hold on power. This is not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It is the deliberate act of those who have chosen to serve their own interests over the good of the people, who have sacrificed the ideal of unity on the altar of personal ambition. The corruption of their thinking also manifests in their inability to recognize the consequences of their actions. In calling half the nation garbage, they do not just insult individuals. They erode the very fabric of unity and trust that holds society together. They cannot see that their contempt sows seeds of resentment, that their arrogance breeds division, and that their duplicity fosters disillusionment. They are so consumed by their own sense of superiority that they cannot perceive the damage they are doing, not only to those they disparage, but to the nation as a whole. Their cognitive corruption blinds them to the reality that true unity cannot be achieved through denigration, and that real progress cannot be built on a foundation of contempt. In this blindness, they reveal a spiritual sickness that has poisoned their ability to discern truth from falsehood, unity from division, and leadership from tyranny. They cannot see that by vilifying those who disagree, they are dismantling the very concept of a unified nation. They cannot recognize that by dismissing half of the population as unworthy, they are betraying the principles of democracy, equality, and respect that they claim to uphold. Their souls are so entrenched in darkness that they can no longer distinguish between words and actions, believing that as long as they proclaim themselves as unifiers, their actions need not align with their rhetoric. But this duplicity is self-destructive. The more they claim to unify while dividing, the more they expose the emptiness of their leadership. Their contempt for others, masked by hollow words of unity, reveals their lack of genuine empathy and their inability to lead a diverse and pluralistic society. True unity requires humility, a willingness to see value in every individual and to listen to voices of dissent. But their minds, so clouded by ego and so corrupted by power, cannot understand this. They cannot grasp that unity built on exclusion is not unity at all, but the beginning of tyranny. Their duplicity does more than reveal their spiritual rot. It acts as a catalyst for division, creating an environment where mutual respect and shared purpose become impossible. In calling themselves unifiers, they try to cloak themselves in the language of virtue, yet their words ring hollow to anyone who observes their actions. The public sees through the veneer, recognizing that their claims of unity are a facade, a thin mask for an agenda that is divisive at its core. Their cognitive corruption has rendered them incapable of self-reflection, so steeped in self-righteousness that they are blind to the damage they inflict on the very people they are supposed to serve. This corruption is the outcome of a soul that has rejected the light of humility, choosing instead to dwell in the darkness of pride, contempt, and self-glorification. Their claim to unify while sowing division is not merely hypocritical, it is spiritually poisonous, an affront to both the divine law of unity and the natural law of respect for human dignity. By demonizing those they are called to serve, by dismissing entire populations as garbage or worthless, they reveal the complete disintegration of their moral compass. A compass that now points not to service, but to self-service, not to unity, but to control. In the end, this duplicity will bring about their downfall, for a nation cannot be led by those who despise its people, and unity cannot be achieved by those who regard half the population with contempt. Their own words will testify against them, and the spiritual rot they harbor will be laid bare for all to see. The public, tired of empty rhetoric and hollow promises, will no longer accept leaders who claim unity while embodying division. This duplicity, this cognitive corruption, will ultimately expose the darkness of their intentions, revealing that beneath the surface of their power lies nothing but a void, an emptiness that no amount of control or manipulation can fill. Their legacy will be one of division, not unity, of betrayal, not leadership. And as their own words turn against them, as their duplicity is stripped away, they will face the undeniable truth that a nation built on contempt cannot stand. In their blindness, they have sown the seeds of their own judgment, for they have revealed not the strength of their leadership, but the weakness of their character, not the power of their vision, but the poverty of their souls. Their legacy will be one that condemns them, standing as an irrefutable testimony to their corruption and their role as corrupters of the public good and the very system they were entrusted to uphold. In time, their names will be remembered not with honor, but with contempt, as symbols of self-serving deceit and betrayal of the people they vowed to serve. History will expose them, not merely as leaders who failed, but as architects of a moral decay that seeped into every layer of governance, society, and culture. The full scope of their legacy will reveal the systemic rot they enabled and encouraged, a rot that grew through their policies, rhetoric, and the culture of contempt they fostered. They have not only failed to lead, but have actively corroded the integrity of the system, transforming it into a mechanism that serves power over people, personal ambition over public duty. They took institutions built to protect and empower the public and weaponized them against the very individuals these institutions were designed to serve. Their legacy will reveal how they transformed systems of governance into fortresses of control, using public resources to maintain private empires, to silence critics, and to enforce a culture of compliance rather than one of integrity. This legacy of corruption will lay bare the hypocrisy at the heart of their leadership. They spoke of justice while subverting it, of unity while fostering division, and of service while serving only themselves. Their actions have created a hollowed-out version of governance, one where the rhetoric of public good has been stripped of all substance. In the vacuum left by their duplicity, they leave a broken system, bereft of trust and void of accountability, a system that has lost its way because those at its helm were only ever concerned with preserving their own power. But their legacy will also reveal their deeper role as corruptors, not just of a system, but of the public trust and the social fabric that holds a society together. In demonizing those who called for truth, accountability, and unity, they have sowed a culture of distrust and cynicism, teaching people that honesty is a liability and that power is an end unto itself. By corrupting the system, they have normalized corruption itself, turning dishonesty into a strategy and deception into a tool of governance. They leave behind a nation that is disillusioned, fractured, and weary, a people who have witnessed the betrayal of principles and are left questioning the very possibility of truth and integrity within public life. Their actions have set a precedent that may haunt future generations. By placing personal gain above the public good, they have taught those who come after them that leadership is not a service, but a prize to be seized and guarded jealously. They have redefined success in terms of survival and manipulation, creating a culture where compliance is rewarded, truth is suppressed, and dissent is penalized. The lasting effect of this will be a society that is wary of leaders, suspicious of institutions, and skeptical of any claim to virtue. They have fostered an environment where integrity is viewed with suspicion, and where the people no longer trust in the goodness or accountability of their leaders. This culture of corruption, once entrenched, becomes self-replicating, spreading like a disease. Their legacy will be a system so compromised that it actively repels reform, a system where every attempt to restore accountability is seen as a threat, and every call for truth is treated as an act of rebellion. This is the inheritance they leave behind, a system poisoned by their influence, fortified against change, and resistant to any force that might bring it back into alignment with its original principles. They will be remembered not as builders of a brighter future, but as destroyers of the foundations upon which a just society stands. Ultimately, this legacy will condemn them in ways they cannot evade or manipulate. Their names will be etched into history not as heroes or visionaries, but as betrayers of the public trust, as individuals who took the mantle of leadership only to use it for personal enrichment and preservation. They will be remembered for their contempt for the people, for their willingness to sacrifice truth and justice to protect their own interests, and for the duplicity that defined every aspect of their governance. The very system they thought they could control will outlast them, bearing the scars of their corruption, but also standing as a testament to their ultimate failure. Their efforts to rewrite reality, to control truth, and to suppress dissent will be viewed by future generations as a dark chapter in the nation's history. A cautionary tale of what happens when leaders forsake their duty to serve and instead choose to wield power for its own sake. They will be judged not only by the people they betrayed, but by the ideals they abandoned, by the principles of justice, humility, and integrity that they chose to trample. This judgment will be relentless, for history has a way of preserving the truth, no matter how desperately it is hidden. In the end, the legacy they leave will serve as a mirror, reflecting the darkness that drove them and the emptiness at the heart of their ambitions. They will be remembered as corruptors, as agents of decay who took a system built on noble ideals and twisted it into something unrecognizable. And as future generations examine the record, they will see clearly the consequences of their choices, the broken trust, the fractured society, the disillusioned populace, and they will understand that these leaders were not builders, but destroyers. But their legacy will not only condemn them, it will serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of moral compromise, the perils of unchecked ambition, and the dangers of forsaking truth. It will stand as a testament to the power of corruption to infect and decay, but it will also stand as a reminder of the resilience of truth, justice, and the public good. For though they have corrupted, divided, and damaged, the principles they sought to suppress will endure. The light of truth may have been obscured, but it cannot be extinguished. In their downfall, in the exposure of their corruption, a new awareness will rise, a call to rebuild, to restore, and to reclaim the values they abandoned. Their legacy, though dark, will inspire those who seek truth and integrity to reestablish what was lost, to cleanse what was corrupted, and to restore faith in leadership. They will be remembered not for their power or influence, but for the ultimate emptiness of their ambitions and the enduring consequences of their betrayal. And in that memory, future generations will find the strength to choose a different path, to uphold truth, and to serve the public good, knowing the price of abandoning such principles. Their legacy will be their condemnation, a permanent record of what happens when leaders forsake their duty and corrupt the very foundations of society. And it will also be a clarion call to all who come after them, a call to serve with integrity, to lead with humility, and to remember that true leadership is a sacred trust, one that is only ever justified by a commitment to truth, justice, and the people it serves. They will not escape the consequences of their decision-making, actions, or machinations. For every lie they tell, every manipulation they employ, and every act of hubris they commit will bring them closer to their own undoing. In their relentless pursuit of control and self-preservation, they have overlooked a simple yet unbreakable truth. Actions have consequences, and reality cannot be indefinitely manipulated or ignored. The very forces they have attempted to control, the truths they have suppressed, and the principles they have flouted will ultimately rise up against them, bringing their avarice and arrogance into stark, undeniable light. They may believe that they can conceal their intentions behind a carefully constructed facade of authority, that their influence can shelter them from the judgment they so deeply fear. But in doing so, they have set themselves on a collision course with reality. The greater their hubris, the more inevitable and severe their fall. The machinery of deception and manipulation they have crafted will collapse under the weight of its own falsehoods, leaving them exposed and defenseless, standing naked in the harsh light of truth. There will be no more hiding behind rhetoric, no more shield of spin or distraction. They will face the unfiltered reality of their corruption, held accountable by the very outcomes they sought to deny. Their avarice, greed, and hunger for control have blinded them to the repercussions of their choices. In their arrogance, they believe themselves invincible, untouchable, beyond the reach of accountability. But such self-delusion cannot withstand the force of truth forever. As they doubled down on their deceptions, as they entrenched themselves deeper into a system of corruption and control, they unwittingly hastened the very reckoning they so desperately sought to avoid. For the further they stray from truth, the more inevitable their confrontation with it becomes. The consequences they face will be as harsh as they are just, for they will be forced to confront the full measure of the harm they have caused. Their legacy of broken trust, fractured society, and betrayed ideals will haunt them, demanding an accounting that they cannot escape. The lives they damaged, the values they desecrated, and the ideals they mocked will rise as silent witnesses, bearing testimony against them in the tribunal of history and truth. They will no longer be able to hide behind their titles or their power, for these trappings will have been stripped away, leaving them exposed in the raw, unrelenting light of their own greed and self-centered ambition. Their undoing will be swift, yet thorough, leaving no part of their corruption concealed. The very systems they weaponized to control others will turn against them, revealing the cracks and falsehoods they built their power upon. They will see the fragility of the empire they constructed, an empire built not on strength or virtue, but on deceit and manipulation. And as it crumbles, they will be forced to face the reality that their legacy is one not of leadership but of betrayal, one not of service but of self-interest. As they stand in the ruins of their own making, their hubris will be laid bare. The arrogance that led them to believe they were above consequence will be revealed as the very flaw that sealed their fate. They will look upon the emptiness of their ambitions, realizing too late that the power they so coveted was a hollow pursuit, an illusion that is now disintegrated under the weight of truth. Stripped of their illusions, they will come to understand, perhaps for the first time, the gravity of the principles they defied. The reckoning will be stark and merciless, for truth is neither kind nor forgiving to those who have waged war against it. The nakedness of their avarice will be apparent for all to see, the futility of their ambitions exposed in the unforgiving light of consequence. The wealth they amassed, the influence they hoarded, the lives they disrupted in their pursuit of self-interest, all of it will stand as hollow relics of a legacy built on sand. Their titles, their accolades, their empires will mean nothing when measured against the reality of the destruction they caused. Their names, once held with authority, will be remembered only as symbols of the corruptive power of unchecked ego and greed. For in the end, truth always prevails. Their manipulation, deceit, and oppression will serve only as a backdrop to the justice that will ultimately reveal itself. The force of truth, though delayed, is unrelenting, and when it comes as a torrent, washing away every falsehood, dismantling every facade. The leaders and systems who thought they could rewrite reality will be reminded of their limitations, shown the futility of their rebellion against the principles of integrity, humility, and service. This reckoning is not merely the outcome of poor choices, it is the inevitable correction that follows when leaders reject their true purpose. They will face the bitter realization that their power was fleeting, that their empire was an illusion, and that their authority was only as enduring as their alignment with truth. Stripped of pretense, they will see the void within themselves, the emptiness left by a lifetime spent chasing power at the expense of purpose. The legacy they leave will not honor them, it will condemn them, standing as an eternal reminder of the consequences of forsaking the public good, of defying the divine principles that sustain justice and order. This final judgment is not an accident or a punishment inflicted by an outside force. It is the natural outcome of their own actions, the direct result of the path they chose. The truth they tried to suppress will be their judge, and it will find them wanting. In this moment, there will be no excuses, no justifications, and no escape. The arrogance, avarice, and hubris that once emboldened them will be their ruin, leaving them to confront the wreckage of their own making, bereft of the illusions that once shielded them. They will be remembered not as leaders, but as warnings, a testament to the dangers of unchecked pride and unrestrained ambition. Their legacy will serve as a cautionary tale for generations to come, a reminder of the inexorable power of truth and the inevitable consequences of betraying it. And as history records their names, it will do so not with admiration, but with condemnation, marking them as figures who chose the path of corruption, defied the principles of justice, and paid the ultimate price in the stark, unyielding light of truth. As I have warned, choosing the way of Babylon will bring upon us the same consequences that every version of Babylon throughout history has suffered. Babylon is not merely an ancient empire relegated to the pages of history. It is a spirit, a system, a way of life that embodies opposition to truth, justice, and the very principles of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Babylon represents an alliance of economic systems, leaders, and governmental organs arrayed against the ways of righteousness, against justice, and ultimately against the people themselves. This spirit of Babylon has taken root here in America, a nation that was once conceived with ideals of liberty, unity, and a foundation in divine justice, but now finds itself teetering on the edge, having embraced the very values that led to Babylon's downfall. Babylon, in all its incarnations, sought to establish itself as an empire above all others, a beacon not of light, but of power, control, and self-idolatry. It is the embodiment of humanity's attempt to dethrone divine law and place itself at the center of all things. Babylon rejects humility, despises accountability, and glorifies wealth and power at the expense of truth and justice. It thrives on corruption, rewards duplicity, and demands loyalty not to higher principles, but to itself. In America, this spirit is manifested through leaders, economic systems, and institutions that have traded the common good for personal gain, sacrificed truth for control, and abandoned the pursuit of justice in favor of consolidating power. The spirit of Babylon seduces nations and leaders alike, promising greatness through the pursuit of unchecked ambition, wealth, and dominion over others. But what it ultimately offers is emptiness, for Babylon is built on a foundation of lies. It lures people and nations into worshiping wealth, idolizing power, and rejecting the divine principles of humility, stewardship, and unity. The same spirit that drove the ancient Babylonians to construct their tower in defiance of heaven is now at work, driving leaders and institutions in America to elevate themselves above accountability, to wield power as though they answer to no one, and to pursue an agenda of self-glorification rather than service. In America, the spirit of Babylon has taken hold within the economic systems that prioritize profit over people, that exploit the vulnerable and reward the corrupt. These systems, driven by greed, are rooted in the pursuit of material wealth at any cost, creating divisions and inequalities that fracture society and poison the public good. This Babylonian economy is an economy of excess and exploitation, one that treats people as commodities and natural resources as expendable, all in the name of endless growth. It is an economy that ignores the divine mandate of stewardship, which calls for honoring creation and respecting the dignity of every individual. Instead, it perpetuates a cycle of consumerism, debt, and dependency that leaves people spiritually bankrupt and bound to a system that serves only a powerful few. This Babylonian system also permeates our government organs, which have strayed far from their original purpose of protecting and serving the people. Instead, these institutions now function as enforcers of control, guardians of an order that benefits only those at the top. They have become mechanisms of power rather than instruments of justice, silencing voices that speak for truth, undermining those who call for accountability, and consolidating authority under the guise of maintaining order or security. Like Babylon of old, these institutions have grown arrogant, believing that they can sustain their authority through force, manipulation, and coercion, ignoring the inevitable judgment that comes to all who defy divine principles of justice and humility. At the heart of Babylon's rebellion is a rejection of the kingdom of heaven, a kingdom not built on human power but on divine love, justice, and peace. The kingdom of heaven calls for righteousness, for leaders to serve rather than rule, and for systems to uplift rather than oppress. It is a kingdom that honors the diverse peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations of the world, recognizing the intrinsic worth of each individual and the beauty of unity within diversity. Babylon, by contrast, seeks to erase these distinctions, to homogenize and control, to reduce people to mere instruments in its relentless pursuit of power. In its arrogance, Babylon believes that it can replicate heaven on earth through its own systems, that it can achieve peace through dominance, and that it can impose order through fear. But these attempts are doomed to fail, for they are rooted in pride, not humility, in power, not love. America now stands at a crossroads. By embracing the spirit of Babylon, by allowing its institutions, leaders, and economic systems to embody Babylon's values of greed, oppression, and deceit, this nation risks suffering the same fate as every Babylon that has come before. History shows us the outcome of such choices: collapse, judgment, and ruin. Babylon, in all its forms, cannot stand indefinitely, for it is built on a foundation of sand. When a nation defies divine and natural law, when it turns its back on the principles that sustain justice, integrity, and unity, it invites consequences that are as inevitable as they are severe. The ancient Babylonians believed that they could build a tower that would reach the heavens, that they could establish a kingdom greater than any that had come before. But their hubris led to their downfall, as the very forces they defied rose up against them. America is now following in their footsteps, erecting its own towers of arrogance, building systems and structures that glorify wealth and power while dismissing the call to humility, accountability, and truth. The leaders who claim to be unifiers while denigrating their own people, the institutions that enforce control rather than justice, and the economic systems that exploit rather than uplift. All of these are signs that America is walking the path of Babylon. But Babylon's way is a way of ruin. For every Babylon that has risen, there has come a reckoning, a moment when the weight of its own corruption, pride, and injustice has brought it crashing down. America will not be an exception if it continues down this path. The consequences will come, not as an arbitrary punishment, but as the natural outcome of a system that has set itself against the principles of heaven, that has defied the laws of truth and justice, and that has chosen power over service. The spiritual laws that govern justice, humility, and unity are unbreakable. When a nation rejects them, it sows the seeds of its own collapse. The spirit of Babylon is ultimately a spirit of rebellion against heaven, against the kingdom of God on earth. It resists divine truth, undermines justice, and rejects the principles that make for genuine peace and prosperity. By choosing this path, America aligns itself with a legacy of ruin, for Babylon's way has always led to judgment. The divine law is clear. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who seek to control will be scattered, and those who defy truth will face its unyielding light. The towers of Babylon may rise high, but they are destined to fall, for no power built on pride and corruption can stand in the face of divine justice. If America is to avoid the fate of Babylon, it must turn back to the principles that have sustained every lasting civilization: truth, justice, humility, and love for one's neighbor. It must reject the spirit of Babylon that exalts power over people, and instead embrace the spirit of the kingdom of heaven, which calls for service, stewardship, and unity within diversity. This nation must choose between the way of Babylon, which leads to ruin, and the way of the kingdom, which leads to life. The consequences are clear, and the choice is ours. May America heed the lessons of history, for Babylon's end is certain, and those who follow in its footsteps will share in its fate. Just as Babylon was birthed out of Babel, a name that means confusion, so too did its foundation in confusion lead to chaos, and that chaos ultimately led to destruction. This sequence, confusion, chaos, destruction, is the inevitable outcome of any nation or empire that builds itself upon pride, fear, and a rejection of truth. Babel's confusion was not merely linguistic, it was a spiritual disorder, a disorientation that took root in the minds and hearts of those who believed they could challenge the divine order. They thought they could create a world on their own terms, ignoring the eternal principles that govern life, justice, and peace. But in their confusion, they sowed chaos, and from that chaos, destruction followed as surely as night follows day. No government, nation, or empire is immune from these consequences. The story of Babel and Babylon is a universal truth, a blueprint of what happens when human pride seeks to replace divine wisdom, when people and their systems grow so entangled in self-worship that they lose sight of the moral and ethical foundations that sustain them. Confusion becomes the first symptom of this decay as leaders and institutions lose their grasp on truth, substituting it with narratives that serve only to perpetuate their power. This confusion infects every level of governance, clouding judgment, distorting perception, and creating a culture where lies are seen as truth and truth as lies. In their pride, they convince themselves that they are immune to consequences, that they are somehow above the laws that govern everyone else. But history tells a different story. The confusion of Babel, now manifesting as the spirit of Babylon, leads directly to chaos. As leaders and systems reject accountability and disregard truth, they create a disordered society, one where justice is undermined, trust is shattered, and fear becomes the driving force behind every action. The structures they build, though grand in appearance, are hollow at their core, held together by manipulation, coercion, and a fragile veneer of stability. This chaos spreads through every institution, as confusion begets division, and division breeds instability. When a government or system descends into chaos, it can no longer effectively serve the people. Instead, it becomes a weapon wielded against them, a force that erodes unity, fosters hostility, and perpetuates an ever-widening chasm between rulers and the ruled. The chaos brought forth by this confusion is not a harmless disorder, it is a destructive force that destabilizes every pillar of society. Law becomes arbitrary, morality becomes subjective, and the people lose faith in those meant to serve them. The institutions that once upheld justice are turned into tools of oppression, wielded by leaders who no longer recognize the true purpose of their power. In this state of moral and ethical rot, decisions are made not with wisdom or integrity, but with a desperate, fear-driven need to maintain control. This is the hallmark of a system on the brink of destruction, a government or empire that, in its confusion, sows chaos and, in doing so, paves the way to its own ruin. Pride is the engine of this descent. It was pride that led the builders of Babel to believe they could reach heaven on their own terms. And it is pride that leads modern leaders and institutions to believe they are immune from the consequences of their actions. Pride blinds them to the disorder they are creating, to the harm they are inflicting upon the people, and to the reality that their power is built on a foundation that cannot withstand the weight of their hubris. In their arrogance, they dismiss the warnings, ignore the signs, and scoff at the very principles that hold the universe in balance. But the laws of reality, of divine and natural order, cannot be defied without consequence. The very forces they have set in motion through their pride will rise against them, as the confusion they sow turns to chaos, and the chaos brings forth destruction. Fear compounds this pride, creating a vicious cycle of control and manipulation. Leaders who operate from fear rather than wisdom make decisions that further entrench their confusion, feeding the chaos rather than restoring order. They fear the loss of power, the exposure of their corruption, and the accountability they have so long avoided. This fear drives them to greater acts of suppression, to increasing levels of control, and to policies that prioritize their own security over the welfare of the people. But in doing so, they only accelerate the decay of their system, as fear-driven decisions amplify the confusion and chaos that already pervade their institutions. Fear, when unchecked by humility or wisdom, becomes a poison that infects every action, leading inevitably to ruin. The moral and ethical rot that accompanies this confusion and chaos is perhaps the most damning aspect of all. When leaders forsake truth, when they place themselves above accountability, they begin a descent into moral blindness that erodes their capacity to govern with justice or compassion. They become desensitized to the suffering of others, viewing people as tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. This rot spreads outward, corrupting not only individual leaders but entire institutions, which become reflections of the darkness at the heart of those who lead them. In this state, even the most sacred principles, truth, justice, compassion, are treated as commodities, to be bent or ignored as needed to serve the ends of those in power. This moral decay is not a flaw, it is the essence of Babylon. Babylon's foundation in confusion and its growth through chaos inevitably culminate in a society where values are inverted, where power is worshipped and truth is reviled. This is the ultimate fate of any system that rejects divine order in favor of human pride, that places control above compassion and ambition above integrity. Such a system becomes a machine of destruction, consuming the very people it was meant to serve and eroding the fabric of society until nothing remains but a hollow shell of power built on lies. The story of Babylon is a story that has played out countless times throughout history, and it is a warning to every nation, every leader, and every institution. No system that builds itself on confusion, fosters chaos, and succumbs to moral and ethical rot can escape the consequences of its actions. The destruction of Babylon is not an arbitrary punishment. It is the natural outcome of a system that has turned against the principles of truth and justice. By their own hand, by their own decisions and actions, they bring about their downfall. They create the conditions for their own judgment, setting in motion forces that they can no longer control once they have fully embraced the spirit of Babylon. In America, we are seeing the same signs that marked the downfall of every Babylon before it. Leaders and institutions have abandoned truth, choosing instead to operate in confusion and deception. This confusion has given way to chaos as division, distrust, and disillusionment spread throughout the nation. And from this chaos, destruction will inevitably come unless there is a return to the principles that sustain a just and peaceful society. America cannot continue down the path of Babylon and expect to avoid the fate that every Babylon has faced. The consequences of moral rot, of pride unchecked by humility, and of fear untempered by wisdom are as certain as gravity. These forces, left unaddressed, will dismantle even the most powerful empires, for no nation, no matter how great, can defy the principles of divine and natural order without facing the repercussions. The story of Babel and Babylon is more than a historical account. It is a blueprint of the consequences of human pride, fear, and moral compromise. It is a warning that confusion begets chaos, and chaos leads to destruction. America, if it continues down this path, will not escape these outcomes, for they are the direct result of the decisions and actions of those who have chosen to build on a foundation of pride and avarice rather than truth and justice. The way of Babylon leads only to ruin, and unless there is a conscious return to truth, humility, and the principles of the kingdom of heaven on earth, America, too, will find itself brought low by the very forces it has unleashed. It is not too late to change course, but it requires a willingness to confront the confusion, to address the chaos, and to cleanse the moral and ethical rot that has infected the highest levels of leadership and governance. To avoid the fate of Babylon, there must be a reckoning with the truth, a restoration of justice, and a commitment to serving the people rather than controlling them. For only by rejecting the way of Babylon and embracing the way of truth and humility can America hope to escape the cycle of confusion, chaos, and destruction that has claimed every Babylon before it. If America is to avoid the fate of Babylon, it must first recognize the path it has chosen, a path marked by pride, greed, and an ever-widening chasm between its principles and its practices. Babylon's fate was sealed the moment it placed itself in opposition to truth, believing that it could construct an order apart from divine wisdom. America now stands on that same precipice. But to step back, to realign with the principles that once made it a beacon of hope, justice, and freedom, requires humility, a willingness to acknowledge both the damage caused and the path to healing. The way of Babylon thrives on deception, on confusion that blinds leaders and people alike to the truth of their condition. This confusion, however, does not have to lead to chaos and destruction. By confronting it, by seeking clarity and alignment with timeless principles, America can begin to break free from the Babylonian spirit of self-worship, corruption, and control. The journey back from Babylon begins with repentance, a collective reckoning with the moral and ethical compromises that have taken the nation off course. The core of Babylon's confusion lies in its distorted sense of purpose, believing that power, profit, and self-interest can serve as a substitute for justice, compassion, and unity. But no empire built on these principles has ever endured. Babylon's own story is a testament to this truth. In its defiance, it became a monument to humanity's arrogance, its towering structures symbols of pride without foundation. America's skyscrapers may be physical, or they may be symbolic. The towering egos, the bloated institutions, the economic structures that place profits above people. But the fate is the same if this nation chooses to continue on Babylon's path, just as Babylon placed itself above the divine order. America's leaders and systems have become increasingly detached from the values that once defined the nation. The institutions meant to protect justice, uphold truth, and serve the people have been twisted into instruments of control, silencing those who call for accountability and transparency fostering divisions rather than unity. The unchecked ambition that drives these leaders is ultimately a sign of moral blindness, a fundamental misunderstanding of what true power entails. For in every era and every nation, true power rests not in domination, but in service, not in self-glorification, but in self-sacrifice. If America is to avoid descending further into the chaos that awaits every Babylon, there must be a radical reorientation. This is not a matter of superficial change or political posturing. It is a call for a fundamental transformation of purpose and values. It requires a return to the principles that once served as the nation's guiding lights: liberty, justice, humility, and respect for the inherent worth of every individual. These are not ideals to be selectively applied, but the bedrock upon which a healthy society stands. To ignore them, to trade them for short-term gains or personal ambition, is to set oneself against the natural order that demands accountability from all who defy it. The moral and ethical rot that has taken hold within America's systems is the first sign of the consequences that lie ahead. It reveals that a society that cannot uphold truth, that cannot recognize the dignity of all its people, will inevitably fragment under the weight of its own corruption. But this decay can be stopped. The path forward is one of reformation, a deliberate choice to remove the rot, to reject the spirit of Babylon, and to seek alignment with the divine principles that offer life, justice, and peace. This path will not be easy. Those in positions of power may resist, fearing the loss of control, the exposure of their deeds, and the dismantling of the systems that have enriched them. But their resistance only highlights the urgency of this change. America must become a nation that values character over power, integrity over profit, and truth over convenience. It must choose to uplift rather than exploit, to unite rather than divide, to serve rather than control. The transformation required is both personal and collective. Each individual has a role in rejecting the spirit of Babylon, choosing instead to uphold the principles of humility, accountability, and compassion. For it is in the hearts of people that a nation's true character is forged. When leaders and citizens alike align themselves with truth and justice, the system will begin to reflect these values. The corruption will be driven out, not by force, but by a collective commitment to rebuild on a foundation of integrity. The consequences of continuing along Babylon's path are clear, for they have played out countless times throughout history. Confusion leads to chaos. Chaos leads to destruction, and the proud are inevitably brought low. But America need not suffer this fate. By recognizing the signs of Babylon within its own systems, by acknowledging the rot and seeking to remove it, America can chart a new course, one that leads not to ruin, but to restoration. This nation was founded with a vision that transcended the ambitions of ordinary empires. It was established on principles that pointed toward a higher way, a way of self-governance that honored individual freedom, respected moral order, and promoted the welfare of all. To return to this vision is not to regress, but to fulfill the highest potential of what America was meant to be. It is a call to reject the spirit of Babylon in all its forms, its greed, its arrogance, its exploitation, and to build a society that reflects the values of truth, justice, and unity. The warnings of Babylon's fall are not threats, they are lessons. They are reminders that no nation, no empire, no system can sustain itself on pride, deception, and division. These things are a sickness, a cancer that, if left unchecked, will consume everything it touches. But by choosing to confront this sickness, by seeking to heal rather than control, America can rise above the fate that has befallen every Babylon before it. The path forward requires courage, humility, and an unwavering commitment to truth. It requires leaders who are willing to serve rather than dominate, systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them, and institutions that value integrity over influence. This is the true way of freedom, the way that rejects Babylon's pride and chooses instead the humble strength of a people aligned with principles greater than themselves. In the end, America's choice is clear. Continue on Babylon's path, with all its confusion, chaos, and inevitable destruction, or return to the way of truth, justice, and unity. This is a choice that must be made not only by those in power, but by every individual who calls this nation home. For a nation is only as strong as the principles it chooses to live by. And if America chooses to forsake the way of Babylon, if it chooses instead to align itself with the timeless values that have sustained the greatest civilizations, it will not only avoid Babylon's fate, but rise to fulfill its original purpose as a beacon of hope, justice, and unity in a world that so desperately needs it. The choice lies before us, the way of Babylon, or the way of a higher calling. The consequences of each are clear. One path leads to ruin, the other to renewal. It is up to us as a nation to decide which legacy we will leave for generations to come. The ruling elite, time and again, have believed that their amassed wealth, power, influence, control, and carefully constructed systems could shield them from accountability. They convinced themselves that their ability to manipulate others, to bend institutions to their will, and to accumulate vast fortunes made them untouchable. In their own eyes, they became genius and godlike, imagining themselves above the fray, above the people, and even above the natural and divine laws that govern justice and order. But history is littered with the remains of those who shared this delusion, leaders, empires, and civilizations that thought themselves immune, only to find that their power was fleeting, their wealth meaningless, and their legacy one of ruin. In every cycle of history, the elite who place their faith in material wealth and human systems have been proven wrong. Babylon, Rome, and countless other empires amassed vast treasures and wielded immense power, yet they crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance and corruption. Each one believed that their ingenuity, their accumulated resources, and their perceived invincibility could defy accountability and escape consequence. But these rulers failed to understand that the principles of justice, truth, and humility are not optional. They are essential, immutable forces that cannot be bypassed, no matter how high one rises in the corridors of power. The deception of wealth and power has a way of clouding judgment, creating a sense of invincibility that blinds the ruling elite to reality. They come to believe that their success is proof of their superiority, that the systems they control make them impervious to the judgment that applies to others. Their wealth becomes a cocoon, isolating them from the truth of their own vulnerability, while their influence and control over institutions reinforce their illusions of grandeur. They surround themselves with sycophants who echo their delusions, crafting a world in which they are always right, always wise, and always justified. In this echo chamber, they become deaf to the warnings of history, to the voices of those they oppress, and to the principles that once governed their own societies. But this false sense of godlike power is precisely what leads to their undoing. In every iteration of the cycle, this belief in immunity from consequence becomes a fatal flaw, or a weakness that ultimately exposes them to the very forces they thought they had mastered. By rejecting accountability and setting themselves above the law, they sow the seeds of their own destruction. In believing that they are genius, they become blind to their own arrogance. In imagining themselves as godlike, they lose sight of their humanity. And in their conviction that they are beyond consequence, they unwittingly accelerate their own fall. They become trapped in a delusion of their own making, unable to see the rot within their own systems or the inevitable reckoning that approaches. History is clear. No wealth, no power, no system of control can shield one from the consequences of defying justice and truth. The ruling elite of every fallen empire believed they could rewrite the rules, that their wealth would secure them, that their power would protect them. Yet time after time they discovered too late that these things are fragile and temporary, illusions that crumble under the weight of truth. They failed to grasp that true strength does not come from amassing wealth or power, but from aligning with principles that are greater than oneself. When these principles are ignored, wealth becomes a burden, power a curse, and influence a trap. In their hubris, they believed they could reshape reality, that their amassed fortunes and influence granted them dominion over truth itself. But in every cycle, reality has a way of asserting itself. The very systems they created to insulate themselves become prisons, and the wealth they hoarded becomes meaningless in the face of collapse. The chaos they unleash upon others inevitably finds its way back to their own doorsteps, revealing the frailty of the empires they built on foundations of arrogance and moral decay. Their riches, once symbols of, their success becomes symbols of their greed. Their influence, once admired, becomes despised. Their systems, once seen as sources of order, become recognized as mechanisms of oppression. This ruling elite, so certain of their genius, so convinced of their godlike status, fails to understand that true genius lies in humility, in the recognition that power is not an end but a responsibility, and that wealth is meaningless without integrity. Instead, they view these things as trophies, as marks of superiority, seeing themselves as separate from and superior to the people they rule. This detachment becomes their undoing, as they lose touch with reality, ignoring the signs of decay within their own systems and dismissing the voices of those who call for justice and accountability. They forget that every empire that has come before them believed the same lies, shared the same delusions, and fell in precisely the same way. The cycle is as ancient as it is predictable. The ruling elite, intoxicated by their own success, lose sight of the principles that sustain a just society. They believe they can defy the laws of accountability, that they can operate outside the bounds of justice, and that they can manipulate the people without consequence. But the very act of setting themselves apart from these principles, of rejecting humility, and of viewing themselves as gods, triggers the forces that lead to their fall. By setting themselves above accountability, they sow confusion, breed chaos, and ultimately invite destruction, not as an arbitrary punishment, but as the natural outcome of their actions. This pattern repeats precisely because it is rooted in the unchanging nature of truth and justice. Wealth and power are inherently unstable when built on a foundation of arrogance and deception. These things may provide temporary insulation, a false sense of security, but they cannot alter the fundamental laws of reality. The ruling elite may believe they are immune, but they are as bound to these laws as anyone else. The only difference is that they, in their pride, do not see it until it is too late. By the time they realize their error, the consequences are already in motion, unstoppable and unyielding. The legacy of every ruling elite that has walked the path of Babylon is one of ruin, a testament to the ultimate futility of amassing wealth and power without accountability. They are remembered not for their greatness, but for their fall, not as gods, but as symbols of human folly. Their systems, their empires, their accumulated fortunes, all become reminders of what happens when leaders forsake the principles of truth and justice, choosing instead the empty pursuits of control and domination. In their final days, stripped of their illusions, they are left with nothing but the reality they tried to escape. The wealth that once seemed limitless cannot buy them redemption. The power they wielded so confidently cannot shield them from the consequences of their actions. They are forced to confront the stark reality that their legacy is one of moral decay. that their genius was a delusion, and that their godlike status was nothing more than a facade. They stand condemned by their own choices, their own systems, and their own deeds. In the end, they are not immortal, they are not invincible, they are not gods. They are human, bound by the same laws and principles as everyone else, and their downfall is as certain as it is deserved. The cycle of Babylon will continue, but each time it does, it leaves behind a warning, a testament to the inevitable judgment that awaits those who place themselves above truth, who worship wealth and power, and who believe they can escape accountability. They were wrong, as every Babylon before them has been wrong, and as history has shown, the consequences are as inevitable as they are just. Leaving the rulers of Babylon to face the reality that all empires built on arrogance, deceit, and moral rot are destined to fall. These elites have built systems, mechanisms of control, to serve their ambitions, rigid mechanistic structures that reflect their own distorted vision of society. They then attempt to rule through these machines, forcing the people under their power to conform to their narrow worldview, demanding that individuals conform to the system rather than allowing the system to serve the people. This mechanization of society, this reduction of human life to numbers, metrics, and compliant roles, is not new. It is a historical pattern, one that operates at the expense of humanity, individuality, and the sacred principles of truth and freedom. As Ian McGilchrist has articulated in his work on the divided brain, this pattern reflects the dominance of a left brain mode of thinking, one that prizes control, reductionism, and detachment, but at the cost of wholeness, empathy, and understanding. In their desire to control, these elites see people not as individuals with intrinsic value, but as mere parts in a machine, interchangeable cogs to be shaped and managed. They impose systems that prioritize efficiency, predictability, and order, but in doing so, they suffocate creativity, intuition, and the organic relationships that make communities and cultures flourish. They believe they can govern through this machinery, that they can impose their vision onto society by forcing individuals to conform to their systems. But in doing so, they strip society of its humanity, reducing life to a series of inputs and outputs, denying the richness and complexity that make human experience meaningful. I, too, have identified these patterns, this recurring descent into mechanistic control, the abandonment of moral responsibility, and the failure to understand the cost of this dehumanizing system. I have explained it in myriad ways, detailing the mechanisms, the motives, and the consequences of this misguided pursuit of control. There are no excuses now. History has shown repeatedly what happens when leaders and elites attempt to rule through rigid, depersonalized systems. They may believe they are acting out of necessity, that their control is justified, but their actions reveal the depth of their error and the extent of their detachment from reality. The choice to build and enforce these systems is not a neutral act. It is a rejection of what is sacred, what is uniquely human, and what is divinely ordained. By replacing organic, living communities with mechanical systems, these elites betray their disdain for humanity itself. They do not seek to nurture or protect, but to control, to reshape society according to their own limited vision, demanding conformity to a system that cannot accommodate the full scope of human life. In the end, they are not leading but ruling, not guiding but enforcing, not creating but destroying. McGilchrist's work on the divided brain highlights this split, the dominance of a left brain perspective that values control, abstraction, and reduction, at the expense of the right brain functions that appreciate context, nuance, and human connection. In attempting to impose this narrow, mechanistic view on society, the elites perpetuate a form of collective neurological imbalance, denying society the holistic perspective that honors both reason and intuition, both order and freedom. This imbalance is the source of much of the confusion and chaos we see today, as leaders, blinded by their own systems, lose sight of the bigger picture, forsaking wisdom for control, compassion for efficiency. The problem is compounded by the fact that these elites, in building their systems, have also built in mechanisms of self-preservation. They create feedback loops that reinforce their worldview, insulating them from dissent, from alternative perspectives, and from the reality of the consequences of their actions. The machine they have built is not just a tool for control, it is a fortress that protects them from accountability, a bubble that keeps them from seeing the truth of their own actions. They believe that by controlling the machine, they control society, and in a sense, they are correct. But in doing so, they also disconnect themselves from the truth, from the humanity they are supposed to serve, and from the natural order that demands accountability. Their failure is not just one of morality but of perception. In demanding that society conform to their systems, they are denying the inherent diversity, unpredictability, and complexity of human life. They are trying to impose a static order on a dynamic reality, to mold people into something they are not, to strip individuals of their freedom, their creativity, and their dignity. This mechanization of society, this insistence on conformity, is not sustainable. People are not machines, and societies are not factories. The systems they build may function for a time, but they will ultimately break down, for they are fundamentally misaligned with the reality of human nature. The tragedy of this pattern is that in their pursuit of control and dominance, these elites undermine the very foundation of the societies they seek to rule. By forcing people to conform to rigid systems, by imposing mechanistic order on human life, they strip society of its vitality, resilience, and spirit. The systems they construct become prisons rather than platforms for growth, cages that limit rather than frameworks that support. They are unable to see that by denying human diversity, creativity, and freedom, they are sowing the seeds of their own undoing. The left-brain mechanistic mindset McGilchrist describes, one that reduces life to data points and relationships to transactional exchanges, is by nature blind to the richness and interconnectedness of the human experience. This approach fails to grasp that people are not mere instruments of productivity, nor are they passive entities to be controlled. Individuals possess their own purpose, their own desires, and their own capacity to resist. And this resistance grows in response to repression, building until it cannot be contained within the structures that were meant to silence it. This mechanistic approach to rule creates a society that is fundamentally unsustainable. The more the elites tighten their grip, the more they alienate the people, stifling innovation, trust, and unity. In pushing people into narrowly defined roles, they ignore the deeper needs and aspirations that drive human behavior. They neglect the importance of community, of shared purpose, and of the freedom that fuels creativity and resilience. The rigid structures they impose may seem orderly on the surface, but they are brittle, unable to bend, adapt, or grow in response to change. When the inevitable stressors come, economic crises, social upheavals, or shifts in cultural values, these systems crack and splinter, revealing the weakness beneath their seemingly solid exteriors. What the elites fail to understand is that true strength in a society comes not from control but from empowerment, from allowing people to thrive within a flexible framework that adapts to human needs. A society that nurtures diversity, encourages innovation, and respects individuality is inherently more resilient than one that enforces uniformity and obedience. The rigid mechanistic systems built by these elites cannot accommodate the fullness of human potential, and so they become counterproductive, breeding discontent and fostering division rather than unity. In demanding conformity, these systems also erode trust, both in leaders and in the institutions meant to serve the people. The elites, obsessed with preserving power, sacrifice their own credibility as the people begin to see through the shallow promises and empty rhetoric. When leaders impose systems that benefit only a select few, they create a gulf between themselves and the people, a chasm that widens with each act of repression. Each decision made in the service of control rather than community. And once this trust is lost, it is nearly impossible to restore, as people come to view their leaders not as protectors but as oppressors, detached from the realities of those they rule. This historical pattern, as I have pointed out in depth, reveals that there are no excuses left. The failures of Babylon, Rome, and every other empire that has risen and fallen due to its own pride, greed, and insistence on control are documented and well understood. The tragic irony is that these elites have all the warnings they could ever need. They have seen what happens when power is wielded without wisdom, when control is pursued without compassion, and when society is treated as a machine rather than a living organism. And yet, despite these warnings, they persist, blind to the reality that they are repeating the same mistakes, perpetuating the same cycle that has brought down so many before them. Their insistence on mechanistic rule reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the human spirit. People cannot be forced into compliance indefinitely. They cannot be reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet or roles within a hierarchy without losing the very essence that makes them human. The resilience of the human spirit lies in its capacity to adapt, to create, to resist, and to seek meaning beyond the confines of imposed structures. In every society where elites have tried to suppress this spirit, the result has been the same: rebellion, collapse, and renewal. The people eventually rise, reclaiming their dignity and demanding systems that serve rather than subjugate. The final tragedy of this pattern is that it doesn't have to be this way. Leaders could choose to honor the human capacity for creativity, compassion, and cooperation. They could build systems that support rather than restrict, that empower rather than oppress. They could recognize the wisdom and the diversity of thought, the richness and the tapestry of human experience, and the strength in a society that values both individual freedom and collective responsibility. But to do so would require humility, a willingness to step back and acknowledge that true leadership is about service, not dominance. The cycle of Babylon does not have to repeat, but it will continue as long as leaders believe they can rule through machines, through rigid systems, and through the suppression of the human spirit. The history books are filled with the stories of elites who thought they could bend reality to their will, only to find that reality is unyielding. No amount of wealth, power, or influence can change the laws of truth, justice, and freedom. These principles are as enduring as they are unavoidable, and any society that seeks to deny them will face the same fate as every Babylon before it. In the end, the only path forward is one that embraces humanity in its fullness, that values compassion over control, and that respects the inherent dignity and freedom of every individual. The ruling elites may continue to believe in their own invincibility, but they are as vulnerable as any who have come before them. And as their systems begin to crack, as the people rise to demand a different way, they will come to understand the depth of their error. Their legacy, like that of all who have tried to rule through mechanization and oppression, will be one of failure, remembered not for their power, but for their blindness to the truth that real strength lies not in control, but in service, not in uniformity, but in unity within diversity. The cycle will continue until we choose to break it, until we learn from the past and build a future that honors both the individual and the collective, the human and the divine. I have been watching this unfold for years, observing how America, once a beacon of freedom, creativity, and unity, has succumbed to the very patterns that have brought down civilizations time and again. The public and private sectors alike have become extensions of a vast machine driven by profit and power rather than service and integrity. Our institutions, once rooted in principles of justice and accountability, have been twisted into tools for control, enforcing compliance rather than fostering community. The spirit of Babylon has crept in, seeping through every layer of society, infecting each sphere with the rot of mechanistic thinking, reducing human beings to little more than resources to be extracted, metrics to be manipulated, and roles to be filled. I have seen this machine at work in every corner of American life. In the public sector, our government has become increasingly detached from the people, obsessed with metrics, procedures, and rules that often serve only to justify its own existence. Bureaucrats and officials sit in offices far removed from the realities of ordinary citizens, making decisions based on data and statistics that ignore the actual lives behind the numbers. Policies are passed not with the welfare of the people in mind, but to satisfy systems that demand obedience to their own artificial logic. Those in power operate within a framework that prizes order and control over understanding and compassion, leading to laws and regulations that bind rather than liberate. This mechanization is evident in the private sector as well, where corporations have grown into behemoths that exist solely to feed their own growth, devouring everything in their path. Human beings are no longer seen as individuals with dreams, aspirations, and unique contributions to make. Instead, they are human capital, assets to be optimized, workers to be measured by productivity metrics that squeeze every ounce of life out of them in the name of profit. Corporate cultures emphasize efficiency, loyalty to the brand, and compliance over innovation, creativity, or the pursuit of genuine fulfillment. Like the bureaucratic machines of the public sector, corporations have lost sight of their responsibility to the people, choosing instead to serve shareholders and executives who live in ivory towers, removed from the reality of the workforce they exploit. The systems across every sphere, education, healthcare, media, and even the arts, have been corrupted by this same mechanistic mindset. Schools no longer teach children to think critically or creatively. They teach them to pass tests, to fit into predefined molds, to become gears in a societal machine that values uniformity over individuality. Healthcare has become a business, treating patients not as people in need of healing, but as customers or cases to be processed. The media, which once served as a watchdog and a platform for diverse voices, has turned into an echo chamber that reinforces the interests of those in power, drowning out perspectives that challenge the prevailing narrative. But as I observe this machine in action, I can see that it is breaking, collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The more it seeks to control, the more it reveals its own weaknesses. In its obsession with metrics, the machine has lost touch with reality, unable to grasp the nuances and complexities of human life. In its pursuit of efficiency, it has fostered a society that is exhausted, disillusioned, and increasingly resistant. People are waking up to the fact that they are more than numbers, more than assets, more than mere components of an economic engine. They are remembering their own humanity, recognizing the emptiness of a life lived in service to a system that does not serve them in return. The cracks are visible everywhere. Trust in institutions is plummeting as people realize that those who claim to represent them have become agents of control rather than servants of the public good. Workers are rejecting the demands of corporate overlords, refusing to trade their lives for a paycheck in a system that gives nothing back. Parents are questioning the education system, seeing that it no longer nurtures their children's curiosity or creativity, but instead molds them into obedient participants in a mechanized society. Patients are growing weary of a healthcare system that treats them as data points, and the public is increasingly skeptical of a media landscape that seems intent on telling them what to think rather than empowering them to think for themselves. Every sphere of society is now feeling the strain as the machine tries to consolidate control, even as it loses its grip on the public's trust and faith. It's as if the harder it tries to impose order, the more chaos it creates. In its pursuit of total dominance, it has ignored the very principles that hold society together: truth, justice, empathy, and the innate dignity of every person. And so, the system's own contradictions are beginning to tear it apart. The machine, built on a foundation of human sacrifice to the gods of profit and control, is unsustainable, and it is showing signs of breaking down just as it reaches for total influence. The tragedy is that those running this machine refuse to see the writing on the wall. They cling to their positions, convinced that with just a bit more control, a few more regulations, a little more data, they can make the system work. They believe that the solution is more of the same: more power, more efficiency, more control. But they fail to understand that these very measures are hastening their own downfall. The system is reaching a critical point where the tension between its demands and the reality of human life can no longer be ignored. It is as if the machine itself is rebelling against those who created it, as every act of control only accelerates its fragmentation. This is no longer just a political or economic issue, it is a spiritual crisis. In attempting to turn society into a machine, we have lost sight of what it means to be human. We have sacrificed values that cannot be quantified: compassion, community, creativity, in favor of metrics that serve only to feed the machine's endless hunger for more. And now, as this system unravels, it lays bare the emptiness at its core. America, once grounded in ideals of freedom, dignity, and justice, has allowed itself to become ensnared in the spirit of Babylon, a spirit that sees people as tools rather than souls, that values power over purpose, and that replaces divine law with the dictates of efficiency and control. I have spoken about these patterns, identified them, and explained them from countless angles, and yet we find ourselves here on the brink of collapse, as the machine finally reaches the end of its capacity to sustain itself. There are no excuses now. The evidence is all around us: the fracturing of society, the breakdown of trust, the growing discontent across every sphere. The ruling elite may try to hold it all together with the same old tactics, but the system is breaking faster than they can control it, and every attempt to impose more structure, more oversight, more compliance only hastens its collapse. This is the culmination of a choice made long ago, a choice to abandon the principles of service, humility, and respect for the intrinsic worth of every human being in favor of systems that prioritize control over care. Now, the consequences of that choice are manifesting, revealing the hollow shell that the machine has become. The people are awakening, and the machine is breaking. We are witnessing the beginning of the end of an era dominated by mechanistic control, a time when society is finally rejecting the false gods of power and efficiency, recognizing that true strength lies not in control but in compassion, not in conformity but in unity through diversity. America now stands at a crossroads. The machine is crumbling, but we have the opportunity to choose a different path, to rebuild based on principles that honor humanity rather than mechanize it. The decision is ours, and it will determine whether we continue on Babylon's path of confusion, chaos, and destruction, or whether we choose to break free, to reclaim our integrity, and to restore a society built on truth, justice, and the innate dignity of every individual. The moment of reckoning is here, and the choice is clear. Their own metrics, their own methods, their own systems, these very tools they designed to measure, control, and manipulate are now exposing them, laying bare the depth of their blindness, pride, avarice, and hubris. They thought these systems would shield them, that they could wield data and numbers as shields against accountability. But in their blindness, they could not see that the metrics they relied upon, the layers of bureaucracy they erected, and the systems they believed would secure their power were, in fact, documenting their own downfall. I have watched this unfold, knowing that every action they take to entrench their control only serves to accelerate their exposure. Their methods testify against them in plain view, and as the consequences build, their delusion becomes visible to all. They operate as though insulated, believing their wealth, influence, and supposed intelligence render them invincible. Yet, professing to be wise, they have indeed become fools. Their own systems, crafted with such arrogance and confidence, now turn on them, unveiling the rot within their decisions, the emptiness of their ambitions, and the shallowness of their understanding. These leaders and elites, so sure of their genius, have created a self-reinforcing cycle of ignorance, a system that tells them only what they want to hear, echoing back to them the false narrative of their own greatness. They do not see the data that paints a bleak picture of decline, of growing discontent, of institutional collapse. They are blind to the warning signs that they, in their arrogance, have programmed their own systems to ignore. They built their fortress on illusions, trusting in metrics and methods that now reveal not their power but their folly. As the people grow aware, as the consequences become undeniable, it is becoming clear to all that these so-called wise men and women have built their empires on sand. Their blindness is self-inflicted, a byproduct of their pride. In seeking to master truth, they have become estranged from it. In proclaiming themselves invincible, they have left themselves vulnerable. The very mechanisms they designed to exert control over the people are now showing the cracks in their own authority. Their once imposing metrics reveal gaps, failures, and declining influence, marking the end of their dominance and the limits of their reach. The consequences of this blindness are not merely theoretical, they are unfolding right now, visible for all to see. Their pride ensured that they would neither see nor understand the magnitude of their own error, and in doing so, they set themselves on a path to inevitable exposure. They are becoming visible in their own hypocrisy, as the systems they crafted begin to fracture, revealing the true cost of their control and the emptiness of their vision. Each failure, each oversight, each miscalculation adds to the growing weight of evidence against them, testimony to their detachment from the very principles that sustain a healthy society. I have seen their end, and it is near. The forces they unleash through their own blindness and pride are now building to a crescendo, creating a momentum that cannot be halted by the same empty gestures and hollow words. They cannot evade the truth that now surrounds them, the consequence of a life lived in opposition to integrity and humility. For in becoming fools, they have ensured their own exposure, and with it the consequences they thought they could avoid. Their end will not come from external forces, but from the inevitable weight of their own choices. In their arrogance, they believed they could rewrite reality itself, bending truth to serve their ambitions. But they were wrong, and now the consequences they once disregarded are gathering around them, as unavoidable as they are undeniable. They will face the truth they so deeply feared, the reckoning that was always coming, for reality itself does not bend to the whims of the proud. Their own systems, the very machinery they constructed, testify to their folly. And as the people see this truth, as the layers of illusion fall away, it becomes evident that these self-proclaimed wise leaders have done nothing but lay the groundwork for their own undoing. The consequences of their blindness, Their pride, their avarice, and their hubris are now undeniable, and they will stand exposed, no longer as wise rulers, but as fools who believed they could escape accountability. The end they thought impossible is now at hand, and their own actions will bear witness against them as they face the full weight of the truth they sought to deny. The machine they constructed, their grand mechanism of control, is now breaking down with systemic errors erupting across every sector, both public and private. Their pride, idiocy, and blindness have grown so severe that they can no longer even recognize the warning signs flashing all around them. As they double down in their denial, they are sealing themselves into a whirlwind of their own making, a vortex of escalating chaos that will inevitably bring them to destruction. Each layer of control, every attempt to tighten their grip, only further destabilizes the system they believed would secure their power and influence. Errors are cropping up everywhere, exposing the cracks in their once impenetrable facade. In government, policies are collapsing under the weight of bureaucracy designed not for efficiency but for power. Agencies meant to serve the public are bogged down in endless red tape. As decisions get delayed, accountability is bypassed, and outcomes become unpredictable. These systems were built to centralize authority, to provide those at the top with the illusion of control over every facet of public life. Yet the rigidity of this control has bred inefficiency, paralyzing progress, frustrating the very people it was meant to control, and revealing a bloated system that is collapsing under its own weight. Meanwhile, the private sector reflects a similar breakdown. Corporations driven by profit and market dominance have grown into unwieldy monoliths, convinced that their wealth and influence would shield them from any consequences. But now, these corporate giants are confronting structural failures, growing inefficiencies, loss of public trust, and a workforce increasingly resistant to their demands. Workers, disillusioned by a system that treats them as disposable, are beginning to push back, leading to labor shortages, strikes, and a decline in productivity that cannot be managed through the usual quick fixes. The very systems these corporations created to keep workers compliant, performance metrics, surveillance, automated management, are now revealing their limits. What was intended to be a seamless machine of profit and control has become a tangled mess, riddled with errors and bogged down by the weight of its own complexity. Across every sphere of society, from education to healthcare to technology, systemic failures are becoming impossible to ignore. Schools are failing to produce students capable of critical thinking, as a rigid test-based approach to education suppresses creativity and reduces learning to rote memorization. Healthcare systems, overwhelmed and stretched thin, are increasingly seen as profit-driven rather than patient-centered, leading to public outrage and a loss of faith in the very institutions meant to safeguard well-being. The media, once the gatekeeper of information, has transformed into an engine of propaganda. Yet even this machine is backfiring as people turn away, disillusioned by the bias and manipulation they once trusted. These errors are not isolated glitches. They are the predictable result of a system that prioritizes control over integrity, power over service, and profit over purpose. As the machine breaks down, those who built it are blind to the collapse around them. Their pride has grown so consuming that they interpret every sign of decay as a problem to be solved with more of the same. They impose stricter regulations, tighten their control mechanisms, and introduce new layers of oversight, all in the belief that they can stave off the consequences indefinitely. But in doing so, they only accelerate the breakdown, adding pressure to a system that is already stretched beyond its limits. Their blindness is as dangerous as it is profound. They are trapped in a self-reinforcing loop of arrogance and ignorance, convinced of their own genius, even as their mistakes compound. They can no longer see the reality of their situation, locked in a state of denial that becomes more severe with each passing day. This denial, born of pride, is feeding the whirlwind of chaos they have set in motion. The more they try to assert control, the more the system resists, throwing up error after error, each one louder and more obvious than the last. Yet, instead of recognizing these failures as the natural outcome of their flawed approach, they see them as evidence of the need for even more control, more centralization, more mechanization. In their arrogance, they cannot fathom that the system they created was doomed from the start. They are like pilots on a failing plane, convinced that their instruments and their training will save them. Even as the engine sputters and the ground draws near, they have no concept of humility, no capacity for self-reflection, and no willingness to admit fault. Their pride has locked them into a downward spiral, an inevitable trajectory toward collapse that they themselves have set in motion. This whirlwind, born of their own ambition and blindness, grows stronger with every error, every misstep, and every failure to adapt. The public is beginning to see through the cracks, witnessing the incompetence and hubris that lie behind the machine's shiny exterior. Each failure further exposes the true nature of those in power, their inability to govern effectively, and their unwillingness to take responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. What they hoped would be a seamless, unassailable system has become a spectacle of dysfunction, revealing them as fools, masquerading as wise leaders, as self-proclaimed experts who cannot even manage the systems they created. Their credibility is eroding at an exponential rate, and with it, the power they believed would sustain them indefinitely. The irony is that their downfall is entirely of their own making. By constructing a system that values control over collaboration, that enforces compliance rather than cultivates trust, they have sown the seeds of their own destruction. In their denial, they have accelerated the chaos, tightening their grip even as the system fractures beneath them. Their own actions are hastening the end, as each attempt to patch the machine reveals yet another fault, another weakness, another sign that the system cannot hold. This whirlwind they created is not a punishment from some external force. It is the natural consequence of their choices, the inevitable outcome of building a society on a foundation of hubris, control, and moral blindness. They cannot escape it because they are trapped within it, locked into a course they refuse to change. The more they try to resist the truth, the more forcefully it asserts itself, revealing the rot at the heart of their power, the emptiness of their ambitions, and the futility of their pride. The end they face is not a distant reckoning. It is here, now, in the mounting failures, the systemic breakdowns, and the growing resistance of the people they sought to control. They thought they could play gods, ruling over a machine of their own making. But they have become prisoners of that machine, caught in a whirlwind of their own design. And as the chaos builds, as their blindness grows more severe, they will face the ultimate truth that no amount of power, no wealth, no influence can save them from the consequences of their own hubris. Their end is both inevitable and imminent, as they are swept away by the very forces they unleashed. In becoming fools, they have ensured their exposure and their downfall, for they cannot escape the whirlwind that now surrounds them. The machine they built is breaking, and with it, the illusion of their power, leaving only the stark reality of a failed system and a legacy of destruction. The consequences, now plain for all to see, will be as unyielding as the pride that brought them here, leading them to a reckoning they can no longer avoid. The machines they have crafted, these monstrous systems designed to consume resources, control populations, and extract power, are beginning to turn on them. The very engines they set in motion to devour the peoples and nations will, in the end, devour them. These systems, crafted with precision to exploit and manipulate, are now spiraling beyond their control, becoming ravenous forces that no longer distinguish between those who built them and those they were built to subdue. And yet, even now, they have a choice. If they were to turn from this path, take true responsibility, and reverse course, they could lessen the weight of the consequences they have unleashed. By acknowledging the destruction they have wrought, and by making sincere restitution, they could still alter the severity of the judgment awaiting them. The machines they built operate under principles of unrelenting consumption. They were designed to feed an insatiable appetite for control, wealth, and dominance. Systems devoid of compassion, unrestrained by any higher principle. These machines know no loyalty, only appetite. As the ruling elites push them further, optimizing and reinforcing their mechanisms of exploitation, they believe they could maintain control indefinitely. But this machine has grown beyond their capacity to manage. The systems that once obeyed their commands are beginning to slip from their grasp, evolving into self-sustaining engines of entropy that no longer serve anyone but themselves. There is a tragic irony in this, a bitter poetic justice. Those who built systems to consume the lives, dreams, and freedoms of others are finding themselves trapped in a machine that cares nothing for them. The devouring spirit they unleashed now turns its gaze back upon them, ready to consume those who believe they could remain above it all, protected by wealth and influence. The force they harness is indifferent to rank and title, blind to privilege and prestige. They will be caught in the gears of their own making, facing the very fate they inflicted on countless others. But it doesn't have to end this way. Even now, as the consequences they sowed begin to close in on them, they have a chance, perhaps the last, to alter their course. This would require them to act with a level of humility, integrity, and courage that has so far been absent. They would need to do what they have avoided at every turn, take full responsibility, acknowledge the harm they have caused, and dismantle the very systems they built. They would need to face the world not as rulers, but as servants, dedicating themselves to undoing the damage they have inflicted on society, on economies, on the environment, and on the human spirit. To lessen the consequences, they would have to make genuine restitution. This means more than symbolic gestures or public apologies. It requires a deep systemic reversal. They would need to restore trust by relinquishing power, by breaking apart the machinery of control, by redistributing the wealth and resources they have hoarded, and by empowering the very people they once sought to dominate. Restitution means returning what was taken, restoring what was broken, and allowing the natural order, justice, equity, and compassion to reassert itself in the place of the mechanized cruelty they have fostered. They would have to relinquish their grip on the systems that were built to maintain their dominance, systems that have corrupted the foundational structures of society, justice, governance, economics, and community. They would need to deconstruct the corporate and political monopolies that have centralized power, monopolies that treat nations, environments, and people as assets to be exploited rather than lives to be nurtured. This reversal would require dismantling of the surveillance state, the biased institutions, the profit-driven networks, and the propagandistic media empires that serve to reinforce their power. If they turn now, if they act with conviction and authenticity, they could mitigate the severity of the judgment that their actions have made inevitable. By taking responsibility, they could begin the difficult work of rebuilding trust, healing divisions, and rehumanizing the systems they once mechanized. They could turn the machine of their own making into something that serves rather than consumes, that sustains rather than devours. It would be no small task. It would require sacrifice, self-denial, and a dedication to the common good that goes beyond any personal gain or preservation of power. But if they refuse this opportunity, if they continue down the same path, dismissing the signs, doubling down on their control, their fate is sealed. The machine will consume them, the systems they built will collapse upon them, and the consequences of their actions will come crashing down with unyielding force. The whirlwind they have created will not spare them, and the devouring force they unleashed will have no pity. For the laws of truth, justice, and accountability are not bound by human designs or exempt for the powerful. They apply to all equally and unerringly, as unbreakable as the law of gravity itself. This is their last chance. The judgment of history, the cries of the oppressed, and the very laws of nature and spirit are demanding restitution, calling for balance, and demanding that justice be restored. They can either choose to dismantle the machine and walk the hard path of redemption, or they can continue to ignore the warnings, in which case the machine of their making will become their undoing. The choice is theirs, but the window is closing. The reckoning they face is both profound and imminent, and the consequences will not be delayed. If they remain blind, refusing to take the path of humility and restoration, then they will meet their end, exposed in the full nakedness of their pride and consumed by the very forces they believed they could control. Until we confront this system head-on, demand transparency, and refuse to accept excuses, it will persist in its betrayal, consuming everything that once made this nation resilient, unified, and true. The choice is ours to remain complacent, allowing the machinery of mediocrity, greed, and control to tighten its grip, or to reclaim the principles that were entrusted to us by those who understood the weight of liberty and the power of accountability. For every layer of bureaucracy that shields corruption, there must be a force strong enough to strip it away, piece by piece, until we stand with a government and a society rooted not in self-preservation but in service. This is not an impossible task. It is daunting, yes, but history is filled with examples of people rising to reclaim their governments, their societies, and their futures from systems that thought themselves invincible. Each time a corrupt apparatus faced a populace no longer willing to tolerate its lies, it fell, often swiftly and irrevocably. But it required people willing to see beyond the daily frustrations, to perceive the deeper patterns of decay, and to act, not as individuals isolated and silenced, but as a collective voice demanding integrity, accountability, and change. In this, I am resolved. The truth may be buried, voices may be censored, and the machine may seem impenetrable, but we are not powerless. This diagnosis is not the end. It is the beginning. It is a rallying call to those who see the cracks, who feel the strain, and who know that this system does not serve them. Together, we can strip away the layers of control, break through the walls of obfuscation, and restore a system that once again honors the dignity of the people it was meant to serve. The future is ours to shape, but only if we refuse to be silenced, refuse to be complicit, and refuse to accept anything less than a government that embodies the principles of truth, justice, and accountability. We are the inheritors of this responsibility, and we must rise to it, knowing that the cost of inaction is far greater than the challenge of change. The time to reclaim our nation from the grip of this self-sustaining machine is now, and the path forward, however difficult, is clear. As for people, so too for the nation.